In 3 days, the planet's surface temperature plummets to -100 degrees. The oceans freeze over with a meter-thick layer of ice. Gold is now worthless. A light bulb costs more than a gun, and a working light bulb costs more than a car. The only currency in this new world is heat. And it's all in the hands of one man whom everyone called a nutcase just yesterday. His name is Dan Kerr. March 14th. He's sitting on the second level of his bunker, drinking coffee from a mug that says, "World's Worst Engineer," a gift from his sister. 8 monitors are in front of him. 7 show normal readings. The 8th is flashing red. The forecast promised +14. The sensor reads -12. Dan places the mug exactly in the center of the coaster, very carefully. For 8 years, they called him Mole. 12,000 hours of welding. His mother had 3 heart attacks because he quit NASA and started digging a hole in the hills near Seattle. His ex-wife said he loved his blueprints more than her. The newspaper wrote about a nutcase who's waiting for the end of the world and will reach retirement age before it comes. 2 psychiatrists prescribed pills. Dan closes his eyes. He takes one long breath, and for the first time in 8 years, his face relaxes. He really didn't want to be right, but he was right. Dan opens his eyes and presses the button. Steel doors, each weighing 14 tons, close. The sound is like a planet coughing, then silence, then work. The sky behind the outdoor camera darkens, as if someone were pulling a black bag over a light bulb. The temperature sensor drops like a pawn on a bomb. -20, -35, -50. Dan jumps between monitors. The geothermal well is holding pressure. The closed-loop water system is running. Oxygen is stable. 18,000 liters of diesel in reserve. On level 4, the hydroponics lights are on, and the lettuce is giving up its oxygen. The mushroom farm is maintaining humidity. The fish farm is circulating. 8 years of paranoia turned into 12 underground levels with triple redundancy. Dan built this for 400 people for 18 years. Now he's alone inside. By evening, it's -67 outside the walls. Dan watches the latest broadcast. The announcer mumbles about a solar anomaly and a dust curtain. Behind him is a window. Outside the window is darkness. Total darkness, as if the sun had been turned off. The screen goes dark. The satellite has gone silent. Dan flips through the channels one by one. Silence, silence, silence. 72 hours after the Great Eclipse, the surface freezes at -100. Cities turn into crypts with glowing windows where the generator still holds out. The old world is ending and taking all its hierarchies with it. Dan has been living alone for 3 days. He isn't panicking. Panic is a luxury for those who weren't prepared. He works. He cleans the water filter. He recalibrates the sensors. He eats rice and beans at a long table for 120 people. The fork clatters against the bowl, and the sound fades into the void. On the 3rd day, he is awakened by a sound he hasn't heard in 8 years. Someone is banging on the gate. Dan walks over to the monitor. The camera is frozen, but he sees a figure, small, hunchbacked. She's pounding her fist against the steel. It's -98 degrees outside the gate. A person wouldn't survive 10 minutes out here. Dan presses the intercom and asks who's there. A woman's voice, hoarse, barely audible. Her name is Sarah Lynn. She's a veterinarian. She's been walking for 2 days from a town 20 kilometers away. She's been sleeping in abandoned cars. Her hands are frostbitten, and under her jacket are 2 puppies from the shelter that she didn't abandon. Inside, it's 22 degrees and smells of greenery. Outside the gate, it's -98. Dan thinks for 3 seconds. He presses the button. The airlock opens. Sarah falls to the floor and doesn't get up. Her hands are black up to her wrists. 3rd-degree frostbite. The puppies under her jacket are alive. They're whimpering. She looks up at him and wheezes that if he saves the dogs, she'll be his best doctor. Dan says he needs a vet, not a doctor. She replies that a vet knows anatomy and surgery just as well as a general practitioner, and there aren't many human doctors left these days. Dan leads her to the medical bay. For 6 hours, he treats his hands according to instructions from his database. 3 fingers on his left hand cannot be saved. The rest will survive. He puts the puppies in an empty cabin and gives them soaked food from the NZ. For the first time in 6 days, Dan has dinner with someone else.
Sarah eats with her left hand because her right is bandaged.
They are silent. It suits them both. Dan has the charisma of an engineer explaining why your Wi-Fi isn't working. Sarah doesn't cry in front of people. 8 years ago, she didn't get her younger brother to the hospital in time. Ever since then, she's had to make it in time no matter what. She doesn't need words. She needs a table where she can be silent. Dan gives her exactly that. On the 9th day, everything falls apart. 87 people arrive at the gate. Families, children, the elderly, some in jackets, some in blankets. Dan's hands are shaking, not from fear, from the sheer scale of it. He presses the intercom and orders them to approach in groups of 10. The airlock can't hold anymore. 3 groups enter. Then a man runs out of the 4th, carrying a girl in his arms. Her chest is heaving, a wheeze, a gasp. The father yells that his daughter has asthma, and without an inhaler and warmth, she won't make it through the night. Dan opens the airlock out of turn. The man rushes inside. The crowd pushes in behind him. A stampede. Screams. People are banging against the steel. Greg, a former electrician whom Dan hired before the eclipse, yells that they can't save everyone and that the airlock is about to freeze solid and rip the seals apart. Dan closes the gate. People are left behind. They scream and pound on the steel. The sound is muffled and terrifying. Dan stands on this side and listens. Inside, the father is sobbing. The girl's name is Lily. She's 6. The inhaler is empty. Sarah examines her and says that without salbutamol, the girl will last a day, maybe 2. The attacks will come more often. Dan nods silently and leaves. He goes up to level 4, past the purple hydroponic lamps. He enters a room labeled Chem Lab, shelves of chemicals, a centrifuge. He enters a room labeled Chem Lab, shelves of reagents, a centrifuge, a synthesizer. Dan takes out 3 jars of white powder, precursors for salbutamol. He ordered them 6 years ago. His sister asked him back then why he needed 3 kilograms of that junk. He couldn't explain it. He just knew that someday, someone would need it. For 40 minutes, his hands move with precision. Scales, heating, filtration. In theory, he'd done this 100 times. In practice, not once.
But the theory was sound. 40 minutes later, he's holding a homemade inhaler. He runs downstairs and hands it to Sarah. Sarah administers the dose. Lily breathes. The wheezing subsides. His heart skips a beat. The girl opens her eyes and looks at her father. Her father looks at Dan. No one has ever looked at Dan like that before. Not his wife, not his colleagues at NASA, not his mother. Her father says thank you 3 times. Dan nods awkwardly and goes back to his cabin. He sits down on his bunk. And for the first time in 8 years, he cries. Not out of grief, because all of this wasn't in vain. And this is where the strangest part begins. Something flashes before his eyes. A semi-transparent interface. Letters and numbers hang right in the air. Dan blinks. He rubs his eyes. It doesn't disappear. The bunker system is activated. Architect of a closed ecosystem. Rank D. Lives saved, 16. Closed cycles, 7. Sustainability points, 340. Dan looks at his hands, then back at the text. He's an engineer. He doesn't believe in magic, but the interface displays precise data on his systems. The oxygen percentage at every level, the temperature in the fish farm,
diesel consumption in liters per hour. Everything he knows himself, but synthesized into a single picture with a precision his sensors cannot provide. Dan stands up, wipes his face. He doesn't understand where this came from or why. But if he's been given a tool, he'll use it. Questions later. Right now, just outside the walls, 116 people are hanging on him. For 3 weeks, Dan has been sleeping 4 hours a night. People are coming, one by one, in pairs, in families. He puts each one through the procedure. The airlock, the medical exam, the cabin, the rules. So many liters of water, so many calories. The lights in the corridors go out at 10 p.m. Trash is sorted into 6 categories because in a closed cycle, every gram of organic matter is a future harvest. Sarah conducts medical exams. Greg fixes whatever breaks. And a lot breaks because systems designed for 400 people creak under the load of 20, 30, and 50. By the end of the month, there are 87 people inside, and Dan realizes he can't handle it alone. Not the systems are working hard. The people. Because 87 people underground means 87 personalities and 87 opinions on how to live. An electrician from Portland is butting heads with an accountant from San Francisco over a shower. A mother of 2 demands a separate room. A former physicist claims that Dan is calculating oxygen levels incorrectly and that he can handle it better himself. Dan listens to everyone. He goes to the command center. The interface highlights the graphs. Oxygen is stable. Water is stable. Food for 18 years. The problem isn't with the systems. The problem is that Dan doesn't know how to be mayor. He knows how to build, and so he does what he knows how to do. He builds a system. Dan announces the level council, 1 representative from each floor. The residents choose them. The council decides on daily life, showers, rations, conflicts. Dan takes charge of engineering and security. He delegates the rest. Not because it's democracy, but because if he spends time counting how many minutes everyone spends in the shower, he'll miss the nitrogen cycle between the fish farm and the hydroponics. And if the nitrogen cycle breaks down in 3 months, everyone will be eating toxic salad. Day 34. There are 112 people in the Ark. Dan stands at the surveillance monitor and watches a group of 23 people approaching the gate. They're marching in formation. Not civilians. Military. At the front is a woman in an army parka with major's insignia on her shoulder. Behind her, soldiers and civilians are mixed together. Some are limping. One is on a stretcher. Dan activates the intercom and asks who they are. The woman replies that her name is Maya Okafor and that she is a former major in the United States Army Corps of Engineers. She led these people on foot for 180 kilometers through a wasteland. She lost 7 along the way. Frostbite, exhaustion, 1 heart attack. She says this in a steady voice, without a tremor. Dan hears in that voice a weariness so deep that it has ceased to be mere weariness and has become something permanent. Then Maya says something no military group leader before her has ever said. She says that she and her people are at his disposal, that he built this place, that he knows how it works, that she won't make demands. She's offering. Dan opens the gate. For the next 48 hours, Dan and Sarah tend to the wounded from Maya's group. 3 with second-degree frostbite, 1 with a broken leg that healed improperly on the road. Sarah resets the fracture, without anesthesia because supplies are limited. The soldier bites a belt and doesn't scream. Maya stands nearby and holds his hand. When Sarah finishes, Maya asks Dan what needs to be done. Dan says he needs someone to take charge of security, patrolling the levels, controlling the airlock.
monitoring the exterior cameras. He's an engineer, not a soldier, and if anyone comes to the gates, not refugees, but those who want to take the Ark by force, he won't know what to do. Maya nods once. 4 hours later, the Ark has a security system, posts, duty schedules, a protocol for handling break-in attempts. Maya does this as naturally as she breathes, effortlessly, without fuss. Dan looks at her and thinks she's one of those people born with a crisis manual already in their head. On the 38th day, Jia Park arrives. She is small, skinny, with lotus tattoos on her wrists. She speaks English with a Korean accent.
She's shivering so hard her teeth are chattering. Dan guides her through the airlock and leads her to the medical bay. Sarah examines her. There's almost no frostbite because Jia had been hiding in a supermarket basement for 2 weeks before she heard on the radio that there was a bunker somewhere in the hills. The radio didn't belong to her. The battery was dying. She memorized the direction and walked for a day. Dan asks what she does for a living. Jia says she's a barista and food blogger from Seoul. She was on an internship in Seattle when everything happened. Dan nods and jots it down in his log. A cook. The Ark needs a cook. The cafeteria is open, but the food there is calories, not nourishment. Rice, beans, mushrooms, vitamin supplements, all edible, nothing tasty. Jia goes to the cafeteria. She tries the rice with mushrooms. She grimaces. Then she goes to level 4 and sees the hydroponic greenhouse. She stops at the threshold. She stands there for a minute. 2. Dan watches through the camera as her face changes. Something inside her that had been dead for the past 2 weeks begins to breathe. Jia turns toward the camera as if she knows he's watching and says one sentence. She wants to make real bread. Because there is no real bread here, and that is unacceptable. 3 days later, the cafeteria smells different. Jia took flour from the supplies. She found yeast in the freezer on shelf 7. She built an oven out of an industrial convection oven that Dan bought 8 years ago for drying parts. The bread turned out rough, heavy, with a thick crust. But it was real, warm, fresh. When Jia placed it on the table in the dining hall, the conversations fell silent. Everyone looked at the bread, then at Jia, then at each other. Someone started crying. Not out of grief, because of the smell. Because the smell of fresh bread is the smell of a world where everything was still normal. Jia stood there, blushing to her ears, not knowing where to put her hands. Dan walked over. He took a piece, took a bite, said she needed to adjust the humidity to 0.3% because of the pressure at level 6. Jia looked at him and laughed. It was the first laugh in the Ark in 38 days. Dan hadn't expected what happened next. He thought the Ark was an engineering problem. Oxygen, water, food, electricity, numbers, graphs, closed loops. But Jia's bread showed him what he knew in theory, but didn't understand in practice. People don't survive for the sake of survival. They survive for the sake of bread. For the sake of the smell. For the sake of the taste that reminds you that you are a human being and not a unit in an oxygen balance calculation. Dan read everything there was about Soviet polar stations and Antarctic overwinters and Biosphere 2 and the Sirius Project. He knew that the psyche in a confined space breaks down not from the fear of death, but from the little things. Stale laundry, lack of personal space, poor lighting. That's why in the Ark, each cabin has its own window with a simulated sunrise based on the time zone of the person's home country. But the bread was something else. The bread was proof that life doesn't just go on, it's worth going on. Dan added a new line to the calculations. Kitchen, level 6. Resource priority, high. On the 42nd day, a crowd approaches the gates. The very crowd Dan had feared from day 1. Not 87, not 23. Over 300 people. They came from different places. Some had been walking for a week, some for 2. Word of the Ark had spread across the dying world faster than Dan had anticipated. Walkie-talkies, notes, shouts across the frozen streets. Somewhere in the hills there's a bunker. It's warm there. There's light there. There's greenery there. Dan looks at the monitor and counts. There are 135 people inside. Estimated maximum, 400. He can let in another 265. There are over 300 outside the gates. Not everyone will get in. He knows that. They know that. But for now, they still have hope. Dan turns on the intercom and says he'll let them in one at a time. Children and the sick first. Then people with skills the Ark needs, doctors, engineers, electricians, cooks, teachers, farmers. Then everyone else until the limit is reached. The crowd is buzzing. Someone shouts that it's unfair. Someone shouts that they have a right. Some just stand there in silence. Maya leads 4 of her soldiers to the inner side of the gate in case the crowd breaks through the barrier. The admission process takes 14 hours. Dan stands at the monitor for all 14. He drinks coffee from the same mug with the inscription about the worst engineer. Sarah examines everyone at the entrance. Frostbite, infections, broken bones. One man with a gunshot wound to the shoulder. Sarah removes the bullet with tweezers and cleans the wound with antiseptic. The man says he was attacked on the 3rd day of the journey. A gang. They took his backpack with food. He ran. Then he walked for another 4 days on nothing but water he obtained by melting ice with a lighter. Dan records the information. Gangs. He expected this. The world is falling apart. Structures are collapsing. People are gathering into groups based on 2 principles. The first principle is mutual aid. The second is looting. The difference between them is determined by whether there was someone in the group who said, "We won't take from the weak," or whether there wasn't. By the end of the 14th hour, Dan had let in 241 people. There are 376 inside. 24 spots left until capacity. More than 70 people remain outside the gates. Dan watches them through the camera. A woman with a boy of about 10. 2 men in security uniforms. An old man in a wheelchair being pushed by a teenager. An elderly couple holding hands. Dan switches the system interface. Oxygen balance. With 400 people, the system holds. At 420, a shortage begins in 3 months. At 450, in 6 weeks. Dan closes his eyes. He can let in another 24. 24 out of 70-some. He opens his eyes and begins to choose. The woman with a boy. An old man in a wheelchair and a teenager. An elderly couple. A man who said he was an electrician. A woman who said she was a nurse. More families, more children. He counts. 20, 22, 24. The gates close. Just over 50 people remain behind them. They stand in the cold. Some are screaming. Some silently turn away and walk off into the darkness. Some sit down in the snow. Dan knows that in an hour they'll freeze to death if they don't find shelter. Most won't find it. Dan turns off the monitor. He sits down on the floor of the command center. He sits for 10 minutes. Then he gets up and goes to work. Because the 400 people inside depend on him. And mourning those he couldn't let in is a luxury these 400 cannot afford. The system interface flashes. Closed ecosystem, rank D, 376 lives saved. Dan looks at the number, 376, not 400. The number will grow, but slowly. He will let in each subsequent person only when the system allows it, when the oxygen balance provides a reserve, when the hydroponics grow, when the mushroom farm expands. 1 person at a time, maybe 2. Never in crowds again. Dan has learned his lesson. Generosity that kills the host is not generosity,
but suicide. And a suicide victim saves no one. The Ark is functioning. 392 people eat and breathe and sleep and shower on schedule. The oxygen balance is stable. The hydroponic system is yielding a harvest. The mushroom farm has been expanded by 20% using an unused corridor on level 7. The fish farm is circulating. A geothermal well pumps heat from the depths. The water passes through 3 stages of filtration and returns to the system. Everything is working. On paper. In reality, things are starting to smolder beneath the surface. Senator William Cross arrived at the Ark on the 30th day. Tall, gray-haired, with a voice accustomed to microphones and podiums.
He had served as a senator from Washington State for 2 consecutive terms. The Armed Services Committee, the Budget Committee, a man who made decisions for millions of people for 20 years. And now he's standing in line for the shower behind an electrician from Portland and eating mushroom soup from a communal pot. Cross doesn't make a scene for the first 2 weeks. He observes, talks to people, asks how they're doing, listens to complaints. He memorizes names. Dan sees this on the cameras and feels what a chess player feels when his opponent begins to set up the pieces. Something is coming. The question is, when? On the 50th day, Cross speaks at a level council meeting. He doesn't shout, he doesn't make threats. He speaks quietly and confidently, and every word hits its mark. He says that Dan is a wonderful engineer, that the Ark is a marvel of engineering, that everyone is grateful to him. But an engineer cannot run a city. An engineer thinks in terms of systems, not people. An engineer solves equations, not conflicts. We need a leader, a real leader with management experience. We need an elected head of the Ark. Democracy, voting, representation. The very things that built America. Dan sits in the corner and listens. He doesn't interrupt. Cross finishes. The room is silent. Then voices begin. Some agree, some don't. Some shout that Dan saved them all and there's nothing to discuss here. Some shout that Cross is right and that one person shouldn't decide for 400. Dan raises his hand. The room falls silent. Dan says that Cross is right. The room freezes. Dan says that an engineer shouldn't run the city, that he's not a leader, not a politician, and not a public speaker. That managing daily life, routines, and conflicts among residents isn't his job. That's exactly why he created the Council of Levels. But, and here Dan pauses, but there are things he won't give up. Engineering systems, oxygen balance, water supply, electricity, hydroponics, the mushroom farm, the fish farm, the geothermal well, perimeter security. Everything that keeps 400 people alive. That's his domain. He spent 8 years designing it. He knows every bolt, every valve, and every sensor. If anyone wants to put this to a vote, they can. But Dan wants that person to answer one question first. What is the optimal nitrate concentration in the nutrient solution for romaine lettuce at a pH of 6.2 under a violet LED spectrum at a planting density of 12 plants per square meter? The room is silent. Cross is silent. Dan says the answer is 120 milligrams per liter, with a margin of error of plus or minus 5, and that if someone is off by 20 milligrams, in a month and a half, the lettuce will start to show chlorosis, and in 3 months, the Ark will lose 30% of the oxygen from the plant cycle, and that he's ready to give up the top spot to anyone, but only to the one who knows the answer to this question, and to 1,000 others just like it. Cross doesn't give up. He isn't stupid. He realizes that the head-on attack didn't work. He starts working more subtly. Conversations, quiet chats, tea in other people's cabins. In 2 weeks, he has a group. 13 people. Not many, but enough to make some noise.
They complain about everything, about the shower schedule, about the portions, about the fact that the lights in the hallways are too dim, about the fact that Dan is authoritarian and makes decisions on his own. Half the complaints are justified. The portions really are small. The lights really are dim because Dan is conserving energy. The shower schedule is indeed inconvenient for families with small children. Dan knows that justified complaints are more dangerous than unjustified ones. An unjustified one can be dismissed. A justified one needs to be addressed. And if you address a complaint, people thank the one who raised it, not the one who resolved it. Dan spends 2 days recalculating. He increases the lighting power in the hallways by 15% by putting some of the unused outlets into standby mode. He changes the shower schedule for families with children. He increases portion sizes by 10% thanks to a new harvest from the expanded mushroom farm. The result is strange. The complaints die down. But Cross doesn't lose his 13. They remain. They wait. Cross is playing a long game. On the 60th day, Emma Vale appears at the Ark. She doesn't come alone. A group of 12 people, students and faculty from a university campus 60 kilometers away. They've been living in the basement of the biology building for a month. They'd been burning furniture for heat, eating from lab supplies.
When the supplies ran out, they set out to find the Ark.
8 of the 12 made it here. 4 froze to death on the way. Dan lets all 8 in because the Ark has lost 6 people in the last few weeks. 2 left voluntarily, saying they would try to reach the coast. 1 died of a heart attack. 3 went missing during a foray for supplies from the nearest town. The numbers work out. Emma Vale is 19. She is small and thin and wears round glasses that constantly slide down her nose. She talks a lot and fast and jumps from topic to topic. After 5 minutes of talking to her, Dan realizes she's a genius. Not in a general sense, in a specific one. She co-authored 200 papers in Nature by the age of 19. Microbiology, plant genetics, selection of accelerated strains. Dan asks her a question about nitrates in the nutrient solution. She answers correctly and adds that at reduced atmospheric pressure at depth, the concentration needs to be adjusted upward by another 3% due to changes in the transpiration regime. Dan is silent for 2 seconds. Then he says he needs her help. Emma blushes and says she's ready. For the next 2 weeks, Emma immerses herself in the Ark's biosystems with an energy that even scares Dan. She finds 3 errors in his calculations, minor but significant. The bacterial strain in the bioreactor at level 8 produces 12% less protein than it could because Dan is using an outdated medium. The mushroom farm is losing yield due to competition from mold, which can be eliminated by replacing the filter at the section's inlet. The hydroponic solution contains a trace element that, with long-term use, accumulates in the roots and reduces phosphorus uptake. Dan listens. He checks. She's right on all 3 points. He makes the corrections. Emma follows him like a shadow. She takes notes. She asks questions. She's impressed. She doesn't hide it. Dan doesn't notice her admiration because he's busy. Sarah notices and smiles. Gia notices and tells Emma that she's being too obvious. Emma blushes and says she doesn't understand what she's talking about. On the 73rd day, the Ark establishes contact with the outside world. Not because Dan set it up, because someone set it up from the outside. The radio on level 1 starts picking up a signal, a woman's voice, young, with a Los Angeles accent. The voice says she sees the Ark's frequency and wants to talk. Dan answers. The voice says her name is Alice Reyes, but everyone calls her Al. That she's a hacker and a systems administrator. She says she hacked into the Ark's external radio communications using the remnants of civilian satellites. She says this with an intonation that makes it sound like hacking into someone else's frequency in a post-apocalyptic world is the same as ordering a cup of coffee.
Then she says she has a proposal. She can connect the Ark's system to the remnants of the satellite network, give it eyes and ears for hundreds of kilometers. In exchange, Dan lets her and her grandmother in. Dan thinks for 3 seconds. Then he tells her to give him the coordinates. He'll send a team to pick them up. Elle shows up at the Ark 2 days later. She's brought in on a snowmobile that Maya commandeered from a garage in the nearest village. Elle is 23. She's tall. Dark hair, cut short. A nose ring. Her arms are covered in code tattoos. Her grandmother, Rosa, is a small, frail woman in her minitsy who enters the Ark and immediately asks if there's a kitchen here, because she hasn't had a hot meal in a month. Jia takes Rosa to level 6 and feeds her mushroom soup with bread. Rosa cries over the soup. Jia cries with her. Dan stands in the dining hall doorway, not knowing what to do with his hands. Elle isn't crying. Elle goes to level 1 and asks to see the server room. Dan shows him. Elle looks at the equipment and says it's a museum exhibit. Dan says this museum exhibit has been running non-stop for 8 years. Elle says that's not a compliment. It's a diagnosis. Then she sits down at the terminal and starts working. 6 hours later, the Ark is connected to 3 civilian satellites still functioning in orbit. 12 hours later, a map of the territory within a 500-kilometer radius appears on Dan's monitors. Thermal signatures, movement, energy sources. Dan looks at the map and sees the world beyond the gate for the first time, just as it is. A dead plain, frozen cities, dark spots where nothing living remains, and rare, bright spots, where lights are still on, where a generator is still running, where someone is still surviving. There are few of them, very few, and one of these points is large and bright, and lies 120 kilometers to the north. Dan asks Elle what it is. Elle runs the coordinates through the satellite and remains silent. Then she says it's a military base, a large one, with heavy equipment, and it's active. The Ark is on its 78th day, 402 people, 2 extra. Dan allowed it because Al optimized the ventilation system and freed up an oxygen reserve for 16 people. Dan's engineering instinct tells him not to use up the entire reserve at once. Leave a buffer. But on level 3 lies an old man named Howard. He is 78 years old. He came alone. A former high school biology teacher. 30 years of experience. His wife died a year before the eclipse. His children are in New York. He knows they didn't survive. He knows this and doesn't talk about it. And every evening he sits in the dining hall by the wall and eats his portion in silence, then goes to his cabin. Sarah says his heart is weak. Chronic heart failure. Without proper cardiac therapy, the question isn't whether he'll have a heart attack, but when. Dan nods. He adds another line to his endless list. Cardiac therapy, which he doesn't have. The morning of the 78th day begins with a scream. A woman is screaming from the cabin across from Howard's. Sarah runs. Dan runs. Maya runs. Howard is lying on the floor of his cabin. His eyes are open. He isn't breathing. Sarah drops to her knees and begins CPR, compressions, breathing, compressions, breathing. 5 minutes, 10, 15. Howard isn't breathing. Sarah looks up and glances at Dan. She shakes her head once. Dan is standing in the doorway, holding onto the doorframe. This is the first death inside the Ark. Not outside the gates where he couldn't see the faces. Inside. A man he knew by name, who sat by the wall in the dining hall every evening, who the day before had walked up to Dan and quietly said he wanted to thank him for building a place where one could die in warmth rather than in the cold. Dan hadn't known what to say then. Now he never will. The funeral. Dan doesn't know how to bury someone underground. No one does. On the surface, they bury people in the ground under the sky. Here, there is neither ground nor sky. There are concrete walls and a ceiling with pipes and the hum of ventilation.
The body cannot be kept. Organic matter in a closed system is a risk. Dan makes a decision that is repulsive to him but necessary. Cremation in an industrial furnace on level 9. Ashes into a container. The container onto a shelf in a room that Dan designates as the Hall of Remembrance. A small room at the end of the corridor on level 3. A shelf, a container, a plaque. Howard Simmons, 1948, 2024. A teacher. It's not enough. Dan knows it's not enough. 400 people stand in the corridor not knowing what to do, where to look, where to grieve. There is no ritual, no tradition, no common language for death in a world that has itself died. Dan leaves, silently. No one asks where. He goes up to level 4. He enters the server room of the hydroponic greenhouse. He sits down at the console. He writes code for 2 hours. Then he checks the connections. Then he adjusts the projectors he installed on the greenhouse walls a year and a half ago and has never used. Then he adjusts the LED panels on the ceiling that usually provide a steady white light for the plants. Then he connects the audio system.
Then he finds a file in the archive that his reconnaissance drone recorded a week before the eclipse. A video of the sky above the hills. Sunset, clouds, birds. The sound of the wind and the singing of thrushes. He had kept this file. He didn't know why. Now he knows. 2 hours after Howard's death, Dan gathers everyone on level 4. 400 people stand before the closed gates of the hydroponic greenhouse. They don't know what's coming. Dan stands at the gates, and for a second it seems to him that he won't be able to handle it, that this is foolish, that an engineer shouldn't be organizing something like this. Then he remembers Howard, who sat by the wall every evening, eating in silence, and never once complained. Dan opens the gates. Inside is the greenhouse. Greenery, rows of lettuce, basil, and tomatoes. Humid, warm air. But the ceiling has changed. LED panels begin to slowly change color. White fades to blue, blue to pink, pink to deep orange. Sunset. Artificial, but so precise that it takes people's breath away. And projectors turn on the walls, and the sky appears on the walls. A real sky filmed by a drone a week before the world ended. Clouds drift by, the light fades, and a sound comes from the speakers. Birds, wind, the rustling of grass, the sounds of a world that no longer exists. 400 people stand in the greenhouse under the artificial sunset and cry. Not everyone, but many. Jia brings freshly baked bread out of the kitchen and hands a piece to each person. Warm, with a crispy crust. The smell of bread mingles with the scent of greenery and damp earth. Hana Cho, psychotherapist, a Korean woman from Chicago, the woman who arrived at the Ark on the 35th day with her 8-year-old son, June. Her husband died in the first week. Hana stands in the center of the greenhouse and says a short prayer in Korean, quietly, without breaking her voice. The words she chooses sound not like religion, but like one person's farewell to another. Emma stands next to Sarah and sobs. Maya stands at attention at the end of the row. Her back is straight, her chin is lifted, her eyes are wet. She doesn't wipe them. Al is leaning against the wall by the entrance, staring at the ceiling and saying nothing. Dan stands in the corner by the control console, unnoticed. He looks at these 400 faces bathed in orange light and does what Howard did every evening. He remains silent and doesn't complain. After that evening, something changes in the Ark. Not abruptly, not in a single motion, but it changes. People stop calling the place a bunker. They start calling it home. Jia starts a tradition. Every Sunday evening, she bakes bread and invites anyone who wants to come to level 6. It's not mandatory. It's not forced. Just bread. Just a shared table.
Just 20 minutes when no one is in a hurry to go anywhere and no one is arguing with anyone. Hana begins holding group sessions, a circle of farewells. People sit in a circle and say the names of those they've lost. Husbands, wives, children, parents, friends, dogs, cats, the house where they grew up, the street where they played, college, work, everything that was and is no longer. Hana listens to everyone. Then she says one thing: that pain isn't weakness, that grieving is work, and that this work doesn't make you weaker, but more human. Dan doesn't attend the circle. Hana doesn't insist. She knows he grieves in his own way. In the command center, in front of the monitors, alone.
In silence, with a mug of coffee on a coaster. Day 90. 3 months. The Ark is stable. Oxygen is normal. Water is normal. Food is normal. Mental health is relatively normal. Hana is holding it together. Jia is holding on. Sarah is healing. Maya is guarding. Emma is growing. Al is watching. Dan is building. And the system is showing him something he didn't expect. A closed ecosystem. Rank D. Progress. 71% to rank C. Sustainability score 890. Dan doesn't understand the ranking system. He doesn't understand who created it or why. But he sees a pattern. Every time he solves a problem that improves the lives of the people inside, the points go up. Oxygen balance, plus 40. A new strain in the bioreactor, plus 60. GI bread, plus 20. Artificial sunset, plus 120. The last number surprises him. The sunset was worth more than the bacterial strain. The system evaluates more than just engineering. It evaluates life, the fullness of life. Dan writes this down in his log. He underlines it. He puts a question mark. On the 92nd day, Elle's voice comes over the intercom. She says he needs to see this right now. Dan goes down to level 9 to the server room, which he has given Elle full control over. A satellite map is on the screen. The northern point. A military base 120 kilometers away. It has grown. Over the past month, the thermal signature has tripled. New structures have appeared around the base. Armored personnel carriers, tanks, heated tents. And from the base to the south, toward them, the chain of small thermal points stretches out. Reconnaissance. 3 of them. The closest one is 70 kilometers away. Al says that at their current speed, they'll be at the Ark's gates in 5 to 6 days. Dan looks at the map, then at Elle, then back at the map. He knew this day would come. He'd been preparing for it for 8 years. He laid the first line of defense 200 meters deep back during the construction phase. He mined the approaches. He fortified the gates. But knowing and seeing are 2 different things. The dots on the map are getting closer. These aren't refugees, not families with children, not lone individuals seeking warmth. These are soldiers, and they're coming for his home. Dan calls a meeting in the command center on level B2. There are 6 people at the table. Dan, Maya, Al, Sarah, Greg, and Marcus Chen, a former Portland police captain who is in charge of internal security on the Ark. Dan pulls up a satellite map on the screen. 3 dots are moving toward them from the north. Reconnaissance. Behind them, 120 kilometers away, is a base with a thermal signature corresponding to at least 2,000 people. Heavy equipment, armored personnel carriers, tanks, possibly aircraft. Elle says she intercepted a snippet of a radio transmission. Call sign, Northern Alliance. Commander, Colonel Marcus Holt, former commander of the Joint Task Force. Dan writes down the name. Holt, Colonel. He's heard that name before. Can't remember where. Maybe in the news before the eclipse. Maybe not. Maya says a reconnaissance team is standard procedure. 3 to 5 people, light weapons. Mission: survey the target, assess defenses, find weak points, return with a report. If the recon is successful, the main force will arrive in 2 to 4 weeks. Dan asks what to do. Maya says there are 2 options. First, intercept the recon team. Don't let them in. Show that the Ark is protected. The risk: Holt will realize he's been detected and move from reconnaissance to direct action sooner than planned. Second, let the reconnaissance team approach. Show that the Ark exists, but don't reveal how it's set up. Give Holt incomplete information. Buy time. Dan chooses the second option. Maya nods. She would have chosen the same. 4 days later, the reconnaissance team appears at the gate. 3 men in military uniforms, white balaclavas over their heads, weapons, walkie-talkies, night vision goggles, though there's nothing to see because the sky is black around the clock. They stand at the gate and study it. They don't knock. They don't shout. They just watch. They take notes. One films the gate and the hillside with a camera. Another walks around the perimeter. The third stays at the entrance and speaks into his radio. Dan watches through the cameras. Maya stands behind him. They watch for 20 minutes. Then the reconnaissance team leaves, quietly, without a trace. Maya says they have a maximum of 3 weeks. Dan starts preparing. Not for battle, for defense. They're different things. Battle is when you go out and fight.
Defense is when you make sure you don't have to fight. Dan doesn't know how to fight, but he knows how to build walls. For the next 2 weeks, the Ark operates in a mode Dan calls turtle mode. All resources not related to life support go toward defense. The first line, 200 meters below the surface. Dan set it up 8 years ago. Steel plates, concrete pour, a stone barrier that can be activated remotely to collapse the corridor ceiling. If anyone drills or digs through from above, they'll hit 200 meters of rock and steel. Second line, the airlock system. Gates that Dan is reinforcing with additional bolts. Third line, the corridors inside the Ark, which Maya is blocking with barricades and setting up firing positions for her soldiers. They have 12 small arms. Not enough. But in a narrow corridor, the defender has the advantage. Dan isn't sleeping. 4 hours a day become 3, then 2. Sarah says he'll kill himself. Dan says that if Holt breaks through, he won't have to kill himself. Sarah silently sets a plate of food in front of him and stands there until he eats. Dan eats, because arguing with Sarah is pointless. She's a veterinarian. She's used to her patients not wanting treatment and not listening to explanations. She just stands there and waits. Dan eats and goes back to work. On the 102nd day, a radio signal comes in, an open frequency. A man's voice, deep, calm, with the intonation of a man accustomed to being listened to without objection. The voice identifies itself as Colonel Marcus Holt, commander of the Northern Alliance. He says he knows about the Ark, that his intelligence has reported it, that he is impressed, and that he wants to talk, not to fight, to talk. Dan looks at Maya. Maya shakes her head. Dan turns on the transmitter. He says he's listening. Holt speaks for 12 minutes. Dan takes notes. Holt describes his position. He has 2,000 fighters from the remnants of 2 army bases and several private military companies. He has a nuclear reactor removed from a submarine that his men hauled into a dry dock 2 days before the port froze over. The reactor provides heat and electricity. He has tanks and armored personnel carriers. He has discipline, order, and a chain of command. But he doesn't have what Dan has, a closed-loop system. Food that grows rather than runs out. Water that purifies itself rather than running out. Air that renews itself rather than becoming poisoned. Holt says that in a year, his canned food supplies will run out. In a year and a half, his men will start starving. In 2 years, his army of 2,000 will turn into a crowd of 2,000 starving, desperate people with weapons. And then they will come to the Ark, not for negotiations.
Holt offers a deal. Dan surrenders the Ark, peacefully, without a fight. Holt takes control. Dan remains as chief engineer. All Ark residents are safe. No one will be harmed. Holt guarantees it. It's just that the order will be different. Military, centralized, efficient. Holt says Dan is a dreamer, that his humanistic model of governance through councils and voting won't survive the first serious crisis. That people need an iron fist, not an engineer with a mug of coffee. Holt says this without malice, without contempt, with sincere conviction. He believes what he's saying. And that makes him more dangerous than if he were simply making threats. Dan is silent for 10 seconds after Holt stops talking. Then he says one sentence. He says he won't give up what he's been building for 8 years to anyone. Holt replies that, in that case, he can't guarantee anything. The connection cuts out. Dan takes off his headphones. He places them on the table. He looks at Maya. Maya says Holt isn't bluffing. Dan says he knows. The system interface flashes in his field of vision. External threat, high level, recommendation. Reinforce perimeter. Blueprint unlocked. Extended range seismic sensor. Cost 250 stability points. Dan spends the points without hesitation. The next 3 weeks pass in a silence worse than any noise. Holt doesn't make contact. His reconnaissance teams don't return. The satellite map shows that the base in the north is active. Vehicles are moving. People are moving. But nothing is moving toward the Ark. This could mean 2 things. First, Holt has retreated. Unlikely. Second, Holt is preparing. Dan is preparing too. Seismic sensors are installed along the perimeter within a 500-meter radius of the Ark's highest point. They will detect any vibration from drilling or digging. Al is intercepting the Alliance's radio communications. The code is simple, an old-school military standard.
Elle cracks it in 4 hours and tells Dan she's offended by the level of their cryptography. Dan doesn't smile because he's reading the plan in the intercepted communications. Holt isn't going to storm the gates. He's going to dig from above. A vertical shaft, industrial drilling equipment, 200 meters of rock between the surface and the Ark's first line of defense. Holt plans to drill through it in a month. Dan sits in the command center and does the math. He has the first line of defense at a depth of 200 meters, steel plates and concrete. Holt will drill through the rock but hit the plates. That will slow him down for a week, maybe 2. Then he'll cut through the steel. And he'll end up in the Ark's upper corridors. From there, it's 4 floors to the living levels. Maya can hold 4 floors with 12 barrels indefinitely if the enemy attacks through a narrow shaft. But if Holt digs 2 shafts, or 3, or brings explosives to the foundation, then everything changes. Dan gets up and goes to level 4. He sits down in front of the system console. He opens the section with the blueprints. He knows what to look for. Countermeasures.
The system shows him 3 options. First, flooding the upper corridors. Water from the reservoir on level 1, 200 tons. Anyone who breaks through the first line will find themselves waist deep in icy water. Cost, 180 points. Second, collapse of the ceiling in Section A, a targeted rockfall. Cost, 220 points. Third, sealing off the levels. Each level closes independently and becomes self-sufficient for 3 days. Cost, 300 points. Dan has 640 points. He can afford 2 out of 3. He chooses flooding and sealing. Collapse is too risky. It could damage the structure. On the 130th day, the seismic sensors go off. Vibration, northeast, 300 meters from the top of the Ark. Drilling. Holt has started. Dan activates the intercom and says 3 words over the Ark. Turtle mode is activated. 402 people freeze. Then they start moving. Everyone knows what to do because Dan has conducted 4 drill alarms over the last month. The children head to the lowest level, level 12. There's a mushroom farm and a 3-day supply of water and oxygen. Non-combatants head to levels 10 and 11. Maya positions her people at firing points. Sarah sets up a medical station on level 9. Al monitors the satellite and intercepts communications. GA goes to the kitchen and starts cooking, not because it's dinner time, because people who are afraid need the smell of food. Dan sits down in the command center and watches the monitors. He waits. Holt is drilling from above, 200 meters of rock. A month. Dan has a month. Drilling continues for 23 days. Seismic sensors record every meter. Dan stands by the monitor and watches the number decrease. 200 meters, 190, 180. Holt is working faster than Dan expected. Industrial equipment, generators, crew changes every 8 hours. Al intercepts the communications. Holt isn't digging one shaft, he's digging 2. The second one is 400 meters west of the first, parallel, simultaneously. Dan does the math. 2 breakthrough points change everything. Flooding the upper corridors will seal off one shaft, not both. Sealing will slow it down, but won't stop it. If both shafts break through at the same time, Maya won't be able to hold 2 directions with 12 barrels. Dan hasn't slept for 2 days. On the 3rd day, Sarah comes to the command center and drags him by force to his cabin. He falls asleep before his head touches the pillow. He wakes up 6 hours later. The system is flashing in his field of vision. A new notification, a blueprint, has been unlocked. An acoustic resonant frequency generator. The description says the device creates a directed sound wave that, under certain conditions, causes vibrations in the rock at a distance of up to 200 meters. Not destruction, vibrations. Precise to destabilize the drilling and slow it down by half. Cost, 310 points. Dan has 460. He spends them. For the next 3 days, Dan builds the acoustic generator. Components from the Ark's stockpile. A powerful amplifier, a directional emitter, a frequency modulator. Emma helps calculate the rock's resonance frequencies. Al writes the control program. Greg mounts the structure on level 1 in the technical corridor directly beneath the drilling point. On the 4th day, Dan turns on the generator. A directed pulse travels upward through 200 meters of rock. Seismic sensors record the result. Drilling of the first shaft stops. For 3 hours. Then it resumes, but more slowly. The rock vibrates and the drill slips, forcing the crews to re-drill every meter twice. The second shaft is outside the generator's radius. It continues at the same speed. Dan redirects the generator. The second shaft slows down. The first one speeds up. A seesaw. He can slow down one of the 2, but not both at the same time. He needs a second generator. He doesn't have the resources. Day 148. The first shaft has advanced 150 meters. The second, 120. 50 meters to the Ark's first line of defense via the first shaft, and 80 via the second. Dan counts the time. 2 weeks at most, maybe 10 days. Maya reinforces the barricades. She redeploys the people. She stations 4 snipers at the first breach point, 6 at the second, because the second is closer to the living levels, 2 in reserve. Dan stands behind her and watches as she places the pieces on the Ark map. She does it as naturally as she breathes, precisely, economically, without any wasted movements. Dan says that without her, he would have lost half his people. Maya doesn't answer. Then she says, "It's just math." Firing angle plus cover thickness plus reaction time. Dan says he didn't mean just that. Maya turns and looks at him. 3 seconds. Then she nods and returns to the map. On the 153rd day, what Dan had feared deep down comes to pass. Senator Cross calls a meeting. not the Council of Levels, a General Assembly, all 402 people. Cross stands in the center of the dining hall on level 6 and speaks. He says that an army of 2,000 is digging above them, that the Ark has 12 barrels, that Dan is leading them to their deaths, that the only way out is negotiations, to surrender, to accept Holt's terms, to save lives. Cross says this convincingly because he's been a politician for 20 years and knows how to speak so people will listen. There's a murmur in the hall. Fear. Cross has hit the nail on the head. People hear the drilling every day, a quiet hum from above, as if someone were scraping the roof. Children ask what the sound is. Adults don't know how to answer. Fear is contagious, and Cross has given it a voice. Dan stands up. The room falls silent. Dan isn't a speaker. His voice isn't trained for the podium.
He speaks quietly, and people in the back rows lean forward. He says that Cross is right about one thing: an army is digging above them. That's true. But Cross is wrong about another. Surrender is not salvation. It is the end. Not because Holt is a bad person. Maybe he's a good one. Dan doesn't know. But Holt commands a barracks, not a city. His model is orders and obedience, and a closed ecosystem doesn't run on orders. It runs on understanding. Every person in the Ark must understand why they sort trash into 6 categories, not because they were ordered to, but because every gram of organic matter is a future harvest. If you replace understanding with an order, in 3 months, someone will break the sorting rules. In 6 months, someone will dump chemicals into the wrong collector. In a year, the system will start to break down. In 2 years, everyone will die. Not from war, from incompetence. Dan isn't saying this as a speech. He's saying it like an engineer explaining why you can't install a pipe with the wrong diameter. Facts, figures, consequences. The room listens. Then Jia stands up. She hadn't planned it. She stands at her table where bread is cooling. She says that 3 months ago, she was a broken girl from Seoul who didn't know if she'd live to see tomorrow. Dan took her in. He gave her a kitchen, gave her an oven, gave her seeds, gave her work that has meaning. She doesn't know what will happen if Holt comes, but she knows what will happen if Dan stays. Bread, every day, on every table, and that it's worth fighting for. She sits down, blushes to her ears. Emma stands up and says that Dan gave her a lab and told her to do what she knows how to do, and that this is the first time in her life that someone has told her that digging in the dirt isn't a waste of talent, but a salvation. Maya stands up and says one sentence, that her people will stay and fight, and that's final. Elle doesn't stand up. She sits in the corner and yells from there that if Holt walks in, she'll wipe all his servers in 20 seconds and let him just try. Vote. Cross insisted. Dan agreed. 387 votes for Dan, 13 for Cross, 2 abstained. Cross accepts the result, silently. He goes to his cabin. Dan watches him leave. He isn't rejoicing in his victory. He knows that 13 people voted against him not because they are bad, but because they are afraid. And fear is not betrayal. Fear is humanity. Day 158. Holt's first shaft the last few meters of rock and hits the steel plates of the first line of defense. A seismic sensor registers the drill striking the steel. The sound echoes through the Ark's upper corridors like a bell. Dan hears it in the command center. Holt has made it. Now he will cut through the steel. It will take days, but he has made it. Dan activates the flooding of the upper corridors. 200 tons of water from the reservoir on level 1 rush into Section A. The corridors fill up in 40 minutes. The water temperature is 4 degrees. Anyone who breaks through the steel plates will find themselves chest deep in icy water in the dark in a narrow corridor. Holt doesn't know this. Yet. The second shaft is a week behind.
Dan relocates the acoustic generator and slows it down even further. 10 days, maybe 12. He's buying time. For what? He doesn't know. But time is the only resource that cannot be produced in a closed cycle, and Dan gathers it like water in the desert. Every drop. Day 162.
Holt is cutting through the steel of the first line of defense, a plasma cutter. Al intercepts his crew's communications. They're arguing. Water. They didn't expect. Water. Ice cold, chest deep. The cutter works, but the sparks die out in the water, and the work goes 3 times slower than on dry metal. One of the cutters got hypothermia and was hauled back up. Another refused to go down. Holt ordered them to continue. They continue, slowly, but they continue. Dan sits in the command center and does the math. A steel plate 40 millimeters thick, a plasma cutter in water, a rate of about 2 meters of perimeter per hour. They need to cut a 1 meter by 1 meter opening. 4 meters of perimeter. 2 hours of work in dry conditions, 6 to 8 hours in water. Behind the steel plate is a 30-centimeter concrete pour, then a second 30-millimeter steel plate, then the ark's corridor. Dan does the math. 3 days, 4 at most. The second shaft is still 60 meters away from the defenses. Dan slows it down with a generator. A week. He has to solve the problem with the first shaft in a week. Dan calls a meeting. Maya, Al, Greg. Sarah stands in the doorway. Dan says he has a plan, but it will require something from everyone that they didn't sign up for. Maya says she signed up for everything the moment she walked through the gate. Dan nods. Here's the plan. When Holt cuts through both steel plates and the concrete, and his men enter the flooded corridor, they'll be trapped. A narrow corridor, ice-cold water, darkness. Dan isn't going to shoot them. He's going to talk. Through the intercom, speakers mounted in the corridor walls. He'll say that anyone who lays down their weapons will get warmth, food, and medical care. Anyone who doesn't will be left in the water at 4 degrees. The choice is theirs, not Holt's. Theirs, personally. Every man for himself. Maya says it's risky, that soldiers are trained to obey orders, not a voice from the wall. Dan says soldiers are trained to obey orders under normal conditions. In chest-deep, icy water, in the dark, with no communication with command, conditions are not normal. Survival psychology. He's read about it. Soviet polar stations, Antarctic overwinters. A person obeys the structure as long as the structure provides safety. When the structure throws him into icy water, loyalty to the structure drops in proportion to the temperature. Day 165. Holt cuts through the first slab. Water gushes into the shaft. His men set up a pump and drain some of the water, but Dan opens the second valve, and the level rises again. A war of water. Holt pumps it out. Dan pours it back in. The ark's reservoir is large, but not infinite. Dan can't keep wasting water forever. 200 tons. He's already used 80. Another 120. Then the corridors will dry out, and the only barrier left will be the second slab, the concrete, and Maya's 12 barrels. Day 167. Holt cuts through the concrete. 2 days' work to the second slab. Dan makes a decision he doesn't discuss with anyone. He goes to level 1 in the flooded section, puts on a wetsuit from the emergency kit, descends into the water. 4 degrees. The cold hits his chest like a fist. He swims down the corridor toward the breach point. In the light of his headlamp, he sees the inner side of the first slab, the cut line, the melted edges. Behind the slab, he can hear the concrete cutter working. Dan mounts directional speakers on the corridor wall. 4 of them. He pulls the cable back down the corridor toward the dry section. He connects them to the intercom system. He checks the sound. It works. The voice from the speaker in the flooded corridor sounds hollow and strange, as if the wall itself were speaking. Dan returns. He changes clothes. He can't feel his toes for another 2 hours.
Sarah scolds him. He nods and drinks hot tea. Day 169. The second cutter strikes the steel. Holt has thrown everything into the first shaft. He's put the second one on hold. Dan shuts down the generator because it's no longer needed. All their eggs are in one basket, his and Holt's. The breakthrough will happen in a few hours. Dan turns on the general communication channel. He speaks over the arc. Everyone is in position. Maya has deployed the team. 4 people are behind the barricade 60 meters from the breakthrough point. The corridor is narrow, 2 meters wide. Only one person can pass at a time. The defenders have an absolute advantage. Sarah is on level 9. The medical station is ready. Jia is in the kitchen. Soup, bread, tea. For those who survive.
The breach occurs at 4:30 a.m. ARC internal time. The second steel plate crashes into the corridor with a roar that can be heard on 3 levels. Water rushes into the shaft. The water level drops. 10 minutes later, people begin crawling out of the hole in the wall. Holt's soldiers. Wet, frozen, armed. They fall into the water and try to stand up, water up to their waists. Darkness. Headlamps on their helmets. Beams dart across the walls. They shout to each other. They curse. They try to form a line. Dan waits until there are enough people in the corridor. 2, 15. Then he turns on the speakers. His voice fills the corridor, not loud, calm, as if he's explaining how the ventilation system works. He says they're standing in water at 4 degrees, that hypothermia sets in 20 minutes, that it's 60 meters to the exit, that there's a barricade and 12 gun barrels at the exit, that they have no chance of getting through. But he says that anyone who lays down their weapons and raises their hands will get dry clothes, hot soup, and a bunk. Right now, not tomorrow. Now. He says he's not the enemy, that he's an engineer and that he needs people, not corpses, that there's room in the Ark for those who want to live, not fight. Silence. 5 seconds. 10. Then one of the soldiers rests his rifle on a ledge in the wall and raises his hands. Then a second. A third. 3 minutes later, 12 out of 15 are standing with their hands up. 3 try to retreat back into the mine. They leave. Dan doesn't shoot. 12 wet, frozen soldiers walk down the corridor toward the barricade. Maya takes them in. Weapons on the floor, hands against the wall, a search. Then dry clothes. Then level 6, the mess hall. Jia places a bowl of mushroom soup and a piece of bread in front of each of them. The soldiers eat. One is crying. He's 22 years old. He says that Holt took him from a destroyed college dorm and that he had no choice. Dan stands in the dining hall doorway and listens. Then he nods. He says that now there is a choice. 3 soldiers who went back into the mine come up and report to Holt. Dan intercepts the transmission through L. Holt is silent for a long time. Then he orders the brigade to withdraw from the mine. Retreat. Regroup. The first assault failed. 0 casualties on the Ark side. 12 prisoners. 3 who retreated. Holt lost 15 men in 1 hour without firing a single shot. Dan didn't win the war. He won a round. But it's an important round, because 12 of Holt's soldiers are sitting in the Ark's mess hall and eating soup and bread, and for the first time in 3 months, they aren't freezing. And every one of them will talk about it, every single one. And the stories will spread through the Alliance like warmth through a frozen body. Slowly, but unstoppably. In the evening, Dan sits alone in the command center. Maya has already left. The monitors flicker. The system interface shows an update. Lives saved, 414. Closed ecosystem, rank D. Progress, 92% to rank C. Dan looks at the numbers. 414 lives, including 12 of Holt's former soldiers. The system counts them too. Dan leans back in his chair.
He closes his eyes. A crackle in the earpiece, then silence. Then Maya's voice. Quiet. She says she stopped by to say thank you. That his plan worked, that there were 0 casualties. That for the first time in 10 years, she slept through the night without nightmares because for the first time in 10 years, she commanded the defense and no one died.
Dan opens his eyes. He says that's her, that it's her plan, that he would have lost half those people. Maya is silent. Then the connection cuts out. Dan sits in the darkness of the command center and smiles. He can't remember the last time he smiled. Holt broke through the Ark's first line of defense through the flooded corridors. Dan set up speakers and offered Holt's soldiers the chance to surrender in exchange for warmth and food. 12 out of 15 laid down their weapons. The first assault was repelled without casualties. Holt retreated to regroup. Dan and Maya showed each other our vulnerability for the first time. After the first assault, there was a lull. 30 days of silence. Holt is not responding. Drilling has stopped. The satellite map shows that the Alliance base to the north is still active, but there is no movement toward the Ark. Dan uses these 30 days the way an engineer uses every lull. He builds. 12 of Holt's former soldiers are integrating into the Ark. It's not all smooth sailing. 4 are withdrawn and suspicious. They're waiting for a catch. 8 are open and grateful.
One of them is Sergeant Thomas Ridge, a former construction engineer before the Army. Dan talks with him for 2 hours and learns things that change his perspective. Holt isn't just a colonel. Holt also received the system, his own version, an interface that shows him something. Ridge doesn't know exactly what because Holt doesn't tell anyone. But the soldiers have seen Holt standing there, staring into space and moving his hands as if turning invisible pages. Dan freezes. He thought the system was his and his alone, that it was unique, that it was a fluke. Now he realizes it isn't, and that changes everything. Dan spends the night in the chemistry lab on level 4, not with chemicals, with thoughts. If the system isn't unique, then it isn't a fluke. That means someone or something created it. And if Holt has the system too, that means that someone gave the same tool to 2 completely different people. An engineer who builds a city for people, and a colonel who builds a barracks out of people. Why? A test. The word comes to him on its own. Someone is testing them, seeing which model will survive. Which answer to the question of how to build a world after the end will turn out to be correct? Dan writes this down in his journal. He puts 3 question marks. Then he crosses them out and writes a single word. Exam. On the 205th day, Al summons Dan to level 9. Urgently. Dan goes down. Al is sitting at the monitor, and her usual boldness has been replaced by something else. She is silent. She points to the screen. Data from the external sensors. Chemical analysis of the air on the surface. Dan installed these sensors a year and a half ago, even before the eclipse, to monitor air quality. Now they are recording the composition of the atmosphere up there. Nitrogen, oxygen, traces of carbon dioxide, dust particles, and something else. A compound that shouldn't exist in nature. A barium isotope with an atomic mass that doesn't match any known isotope. Dan looks at the data. He double-checks. He asks Emma to double-check. Emma confirms it. This is not a natural compound. The dust curtain in the atmosphere that covered the sky and killed the world contains a component that someone manufactured. Not a volcano, not the sun, not dark matter. Someone or something sprayed this into Earth's atmosphere on purpose. Dan has been sitting on this information for 3 days. He hasn't told anyone except Al and Emma. Not because he's hiding it, because he doesn't know what to say. The eclipse was artificial. Someone killed the world, intentionally. And that same someone gave Dan and Holt, and possibly others, a tool for survival.
He built a rat maze, released the rats, watching to see which one reaches the cheese. Dan doesn't know whether to be angry or not. He's an engineer. Anger doesn't solve equations. He records the data, classifies it, constructs hypotheses. The entity, AI, civilization, something beyond comprehension. He calls it the architect, because whoever builds tests for builders must be a builder himself. An engineer's logic. On the 215th day, Dan receives a signal, not from Holt, not from the refugees. The signal is weak, encrypted, from the southeast, 60 kilometers away. Al decodes it in 2 hours. A message from a group of survivors, a farming community, 37 people. They live in an abandoned coal mine. They have heat from burning coal seams.
They have water from an underground spring. No food. Their supplies ran out 2 weeks ago. They're eating rats and boots. They're asking for help, not evacuation. Help. Seeds. Instructions. How to grow food underground. Dan looks at the message and sees something he hadn't seen before. The Ark isn't a fortress. The Ark is a model. If he can pass on his knowledge to other survivor groups, if they can build their own closed-loop systems based on his blueprints, then survival ceases to be a matter for a single bunker. It becomes a network. And a network is stronger than any bunker, because a network cannot be destroyed by striking a single point. Dan announces the first expedition. Volunteers, 4 people. Maya leads. With her are 2 soldiers and Greg. They take a supply of seeds, a set of hydroponics instructions that Dan wrote non-stop for 4 days, a portable generator, a first aid kit, food for a week, a snowmobile, and a trailer. 60 kilometers across the dead plain at minus 100 degrees. Maya says they'll make it. Dan believes her because Maya has already traveled 180 kilometers across this plain once and survived. The expedition leaves at dawn.
There is no dawn. There is only a black sky and the white beam of a snowmobile headlight. Dan stands by the monitor and watches as the heat signature moves away from the Ark. Small, fragile, alive. He follows it with his eyes until it disappears beyond the range of the sensors. Then he returns to work. Maya returns in 5 days. Everyone is alive. A community exists in the mine. 37 people, miners and farmers and their families. The leader is a man named Carl Brenner, a former mining engineer, sturdy, silent. His handshake was so firm that Maya had to massage her wrist for 2 days afterward. The mine is deep, warm. The coal seams burn slowly and evenly, maintaining a steady 20 degrees. The water is clean, but there is no food, and without hydroponics, there won't be any. Maya delivered the seeds and instructions. Carl read the instructions once and said he understood, and that in a month he would have his first harvest. Maya says she believes him because Carl is one of those people who, when they say they'll do something, they actually do it. Dan listens to Maya's report and thinks. The mine is 60 kilometers away, too far for constant communication, but close enough for a tunnel. An underground tunnel between the Ark and the mine. Safe, warm, not on the surface where it's minus 100. Underground where it's a steady plus 10. 60 kilometers of tunnel. That's madness. It's impossible. It's exactly what Dan did for 8 years when everyone said he was crazy. He opens the system interface, searches for blueprints, finds them. A small diameter tunneling shield. Cost, 500 points. Dan has 720. He buys it. The screen flashes. Closed ecosystem, rank C, unlocked. Dan looks at the letter C and, for the first time in 200 days, feels something resembling pride. Dan learned from former soldier Holt that the colonel also has the system.
An artificial barium isotope has been detected in the external sensors, proving that the eclipse is man-made. Dan named the unknown entity the Architect. A farming community was found in a mine 60 kilometers away. Maya led the first expedition. Dan began planning the construction of the tunnel and Arc 2. The ecosystem rank was raised to C. Tunnel construction begins on day 230. Dan spends a week designing the route, 60 kilometers, depth of burial 150 meters.
Enough to bypass the permafrost layer and reach stable rock. A small diameter tunnel boring machine, 3 meters in diameter, electric drive powered by a geothermal well. Tunneling speed, 8 meters per day, 60 kilometers, 7,500 shifts. 20 years at the current rate. Impossible. Dan reworks the calculation. 2 shields, one from the arc, one from the mine. Cross-drilling. 10 years. Still impossible. Dan recalculates again. 4 shields, 2 from the arc, 2 from the mine. Intermediate points. 5 years. Impossible, but in a different way. Dan looks at the blueprint. Then he calls Carl on the radio. Carl listens. He says 1 sentence. Emma solves the problem that Dan couldn't solve for 3 months. Protein. 400 people consume protein faster than the mushroom and fish farms can produce it, a 5% shortfall per month. In 6 months, it will be 10%. In a year, people will start losing muscle mass. Emma finds a strain of bacteria in soil samples from the lower levels of the ark, a strain that converts cellulose into protein with greater efficiency than any known counterpart. She isolates it, cultivates it, builds a bioreactor from scrap materials. 2 weeks later, the bioreactor produces a paste with a protein content of 40%. Jia tastes the paste and grimaces. Then she thinks for an hour. Then she mixes the paste with mushroom broth and spices and makes patties out of it that taste like something between tofu and chicken. Not perfect, but edible. And nutritious. Dan announces this at the general meeting. He stands up and says that Emma Vale single-handedly solved the protein problem for the next 5 years. That without her, they would have starved. That applied biology is what this city is built on. Emma stands in the 3rd row and blushes so hard she wants to sink through all 12 levels. But she remembers those words for the rest of her life. Day 250. Hana Cho is sitting in her cabin. Her son, June, is sleeping in the next room. 8 years old, snoring. Hana isn't sleeping. Hana hasn't slept for 3 nights. She's a therapist. She helps 400 people cope with grief and fear and claustrophobia and guilt and anger and despair. And every one of those 400 thinks Hana is coping, that she is strong, that she knows the answers. Hana doesn't know the answers. Hana lost her husband in the first week of the eclipse. His name was Min Ho. He went out for groceries when the temperature dropped to -40 and didn't come back. She waited by the window for 6 hours. Then she grabbed June and ran. She didn't find his body. She doesn't know where he is. She doesn't know if he froze to death quickly or slowly. She thinks about it every night. And every night she doesn't cry because June is behind the wall. And if he hears her, he'll be scared. A knock at the door. Hana opens it. Dan, with 2 cups of tea. Hana looks at him. He doesn't say anything. He just walks in, puts the cups on the table, sits down. Hana sits across from him. Dan says her shift is over today, that he's listening now. She speaks. Hana speaks. For 3 hours. About Min Ho. About how he always forgot his keys and she left the door unlocked. About how he sang to June in Korean before bed. About how he went out for bread and milk because June asked for pancakes for breakfast. About how she doesn't know if her parents in Chicago are still alive. About how she's tired of helping everyone and can't ask for help because if a therapist asks for help,
It means the system is broken. Dan listens. 3 hours. He doesn't interrupt once. He doesn't offer solutions. He doesn't say everything will be okay. He just listens. When she falls silent, he says one sentence, that a therapist who asks for help isn't a broken system, but a system with a backup circuit. Hana looks at him, then she laughs, quietly, through her tears. She says it's the most engineering-like metaphor anyone has ever told her. Dan nods and finishes his tea. He leaves. Hana lies down and, for the first time in 8 months, sleeps for 6 hours without nightmares. Tunnel construction is underway, 8 meters a day, slowly, tediously, monotonously. The crews work in 3 shifts. The rock is hard. The shield hums and shakes and devours electricity like a beast. Dan redirects 20% of the geothermal plant's power to the shield. The temperature in the Ark's corridors drops by 2 degrees. The people complain. The Council of Levels discusses it. Dan explains. 2 degrees now means a tunnel through which, in a year, new people with new resources will be able to reach them. 2 degrees is the price of the future. People listen. Not everyone agrees, but most understand. On the 270th day, what Dan feared more than Holt's assault happens. A man breaks down. His name is Ron Pierce, 42 years old, a former accountant from Tacoma. His wife and daughter stayed behind in the city. He doesn't know what's become of them. He is quiet, unobtrusive. He goes on his shifts without fail. He eats, he sleeps. He doesn't complain. And so, on the 271st day, Ron Pierce gets up at 3 in the morning. He goes to level 1. He approaches the airlock control panel and begins to enter the code to open the gate. The camera captures it. The duty officer, Mai, notices. He runs. Ron stands at the panel, crying and muttering that he needs to get out, that he needs to find his wife and daughter, that they're waiting, that they're freezing, that he can't sit here in the warmth while they're out there. The guard grabs his arm. Ron breaks free. He screams. He fights. He weighs 50 kilograms but fights with the strength that madness provides. A second guard runs over. A third. They subdue Ron. He sobs on the floor. Hana works with him for the next 3 days. She doesn't leave his side. Claustrophobia plus survivor's guilt plus grief plus 8 months of repression. A classic breakdown. Dan stands at the door of the medical bay and thinks. Ron isn't the first, and he won't be the last. 8 months underground is a long time. 12 will be even longer. 18. 24. If they're going to live here for years, they need something more than artificial sunsets and bread. They need space. Real space. Not 2-meter-wide corridors, but something big, open, where the ceiling is high and where you can walk 100 steps in one direction without hitting a wall. Dan opens the Ark's blueprints. Level 4. Hydroponic greenhouse. The largest room. 30 meters by 15. 4-meter ceiling. Dan sketches. An expansion. Blow up the wall to the east. Dig out an additional hall. Raise the ceiling to 8 meters. 50 meters by 30. A park. An underground park. Trees, real trees, not hydroponic lettuce, but trees. Birches. They grow fast. They're easy to care for. They provide oxygen. And they're beautiful. And you can pluck a leaf from them, crumple it in your hands, and smell it. Dan draws the park until 4 in the morning. Then he falls asleep at the table. In the morning, he shows the drawing to the council. The room is silent. Then Jia says that if there are trees there, she wants to put a bench and a bread oven right in the park and have picnics on Sundays. Emma says she can grow grass in the soil if they give her seeds and lighting. Hana says this will save more people than any medicine. Maya is silent. Then she says she needs a place for her morning runs and that 50 meters isn't much, but it's better than a hallway. Elle says she wants a hammock between the trees and Wi-Fi.
Dan nods. He starts building. Day 300. A year without the sun. The ark marks the anniversary. It doesn't celebrate, it marks it. The difference is important. Jia bakes bread in the shape of the sun, round, golden, with rays made of dough. She places it on the table in the dining hall. 418 people sit at a communal table. They are silent.
Then Hana stands up and says the names of those they have lost over the year. Not all of them. It's impossible to name everyone. But those they know about. Howard Simmons, a teacher. Maria Enriquez, a nurse who died of pneumonia in the 4th month. Tommy Kwan, a teenager who went on a reconnaissance mission and never returned. More names, more faces. The room listens. Then Hana says that 2 children were born in the ark this year. The first is on the way, and that as long as children are being born, the world hasn't ended. It's just moved. 3 days later, the ark's first child is born, a girl. The mother is Elena Torres, 27, a former elementary school teacher from Portland. The father is Marcus Chen, a former police captain. They met in the ark during the 2nd week. Sarah delivers the baby. She's a veterinarian. She's delivered calves, foals, and puppies. Human births are more complicated, but the basic mechanics are the same. Emma is assisting. Dan is standing outside the medical unit door, pacing back and forth. No one asked him to come, he just came. 4 hours later, Sarah comes out of the medical unit. Her hands are gloved. She's tired. She looks at Dan. She says one word. Girl. Healthy. Dan goes in. Elena is lying with the baby on her chest. Marcus is sitting next to her, his hands trembling. Elena hands the baby to Dan. He takes her, gently, as if handling a fragile instrument. The girl weighs 3 kilograms and 200 grams. Warm, alive. She smells of milk and something that has no name other than the word new. Elena says they'll name her Hope. Dan nods. He hands the baby back. He leaves. He walks into the service corridor on level 3. He sits down on the floor by a pipe. And he cries. For a long time. Quietly, so no one will see. Because in his arms, just now, lay the reason he'd been digging a hole in the ground for 8 years. And that reason weighs 3 kilograms and 200 grams. And she doesn't yet have a name for the world into which she was born. But the world already exists, and it's warm. The tunnel is advancing. 1.5 kilometers in the first 4 months. From the mine side, Carl Brenner has launched his shield and is advancing 12 meters a day because the rock on his side is softer. They're scheduled to meet in the middle in 1.5 years. Dan adjusts the course every week based on data from seismic sensors. The tunnel must come out exactly on target. A deviation of 1 meter over such a distance would be a disaster. Elle helps with navigation. Satellite data plus an inertial system she assembled from gyroscopes salvaged from dismantled military equipment. On the 15th day, Holt returns. Not with the drill, with words, an open frequency. His voice has changed. Gone is the calm confidence he had 5 months ago. There is fatigue. There is something resembles despair, but is suppressed by discipline. Holt says his supplies are running out faster than he expected. The 2,000-strong army is a 2,000-strong army, and it eats a lot. His reactor provides heat and electricity, but not food. He says he needs a deal. Not surrender, a deal. He's willing to recognize the Ark's autonomy if Dan shares the closed-loop technology. Seeds, hydroponics blueprints, a bacterial strain for the bioreactor. In exchange, Holt offers military protection from other factions and access to a nuclear reactor to power Ark-2. Dan listens. He thinks. Maya stands nearby and shakes her head. She doesn't trust Holt. She's a soldier, and she knows how soldiers think. For Holt, this deal is a tactical move. He'll get the technology, he'll grow his own food, he'll grow stronger. And in a year, he'll come back. Not for a deal anymore. Dan knows Maya is right. But he knows something. 2,000 people in the Alliance are 2,000 people who are starving. Among them are children. Among them are people whom Holt didn't ask if they wanted to fight. If Dan refuses, Holt will storm the place again. In a month. In 2. Without fail. Because hunger leaves no choice. But if Dan accepts, and if Holt cheats, Dan will have Holt's technology. A nuclear reactor, knowledge of its systems, and time. Dan turns on the transmitter. He says he agrees, on certain terms. The exchange will be phased. First, Holt sends an engineer to assess the Ark. Dan sends an engineer to the Alliance base, a mutual inspection. Then the first batch of seeds in exchange for the first batch of uranium fuel rods. Then the blueprints in exchange for the reactor's technical documentation. Each stage is verifiable. Each is reversible. Holt agrees. Maya looks at Dan. He sees a question in her eyes.
Dan tells her later, in private, that he doesn't trust Holt. But he trusts hunger. Hunger will make Holt predictable, and a predictable enemy is better than a desperate one. The exchange begins on the 330th day. Holt's engineer arrives at the Ark. Lieutenant Adam Ford, 30 years old, quiet, polite, professional. Dan shows him around the Ark, shows him the hydroponics, the mushroom farm, the fish farm, Emma's bioreactor. Ford takes notes, takes photos, asks technical questions. Dan answers. Not everything. He shows enough for Ford to understand that the Ark is functioning. Not enough for Ford to be able to replicate everything without Dan. Greg heads to the Alliance base with 2 Maya soldiers. Returns a week later. Reports. The base is large. The reactor is operational. Discipline is strict. But the people are thin. Rations are meager. The children are pale. Greg says he saw the eyes of the people at the Alliance, and they looked the same way the people at the Ark's gates looked during the first month, with a hope that has almost died. Dan sends the first batch of seeds, tomatoes, lettuce, mushroom mycelium, instructions.
Basic blueprints for a hydroponic system that can be assembled from available materials. Holt sends 3 fuel rods. Dan stores them on level 11. They aren't needed yet, but for Ark 2, they will be priceless. On the 350th day, Al intercepts the Alliance's internal communications. Not radio, wired communication that Al tapped into via a satellite relay and signal mirroring. Technically impossible for anyone but Al. The communications confirm what Dan suspected. Holt is preparing a second assault, in parallel with the trade. He plans to attack in 6 weeks, when he has enough seeds and blueprints to no longer depend on the Ark. Dan reads the intercept and isn't surprised. He expected this. But now, he has 6 weeks, and he knows what Holt is planning. And Holt doesn't know that Dan knows. Dan doesn't stop the trade. He continues to send seeds and blueprints, but the blueprints contain an error, a small one, an imperceptible one. A 12% shift in the oxygen balance calculation. If Holt builds the hydroponic system based on these blueprints, it will work. 3 months. Then an oxygen shortage. Then system collapse. Then Holt will come to Dan, not with an army, but with a request. Dan hates himself for this decision. But he is an engineer. And an engineer knows that sometimes the only way to protect a system is to build a controlled defect into someone else's system. In the Ark, the first child was born, named Hoop. Construction of the tunnel to Carl Brenner's mine is progressing. Holt proposed a trade in technology, and Dan agreed, but discovered through an intercept that Holt was preparing a second assault in parallel. Dan built a controlled defect into the blueprints sent to Holt to create the Alliance's dependence on the Ark. Day 360. 6 weeks until Holt's planned assault, according to the intercepted data.
Dan is working on 4 fronts simultaneously: the tunnel, defense, trade with the Alliance, and the project he calls Arc 2, Carl Brenner's mine. 37 people. The hydroponics are working. The first harvest has been gathered. Carl sent a single word over the radio: growing. Dan smiled. Carl is a man of his word. Dan is sending a second expedition to Carl. This time, not Maya, Emma.
With her are 2 volunteers from Holt's former soldiers who now live in the Ark and whom Dan considers reliable. Emma is carrying a strain of bacteria for the bioreactor, samples of fungal mycelium, a set of tools for analyzing water and soil, and the blueprints for Arc 2. Complete. Error-free. Arc 2 won't be a copy of Arc 1. It will be different, adapted to the mine. A horizontal layout instead of a vertical one, coal heat instead of geothermal, a different ventilation system. But the principle is the same: a closed cycle: water, air, food, light, life. Emma returns in 10 days. She's lost 2 kilograms, frostbitten her right ear, and is beaming with happiness. Carl accepted the blueprints. His people have begun expanding the mine. They have experience. They're miners. They know how to dig better than anyone on the planet. In 3 months, the mine will become Arc-2, with hydroponics and a bioreactor and a mushroom farm and living quarters for 200 people. Emma says that Carl shook her hand goodbye, and that she thought her hand would break. But it was the best handshake of her life. Day 375. The park on level 4 is ready. Not completely. The birches are still saplings, slender, half a meter tall, but they're growing. Under full-spectrum LED lamps that mimic the solar cycle. 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness. The soil is piled 40 centimeters deep. Grass has been sown. The first sprouts are breaking through. The ceiling is 8 meters high. For an underground space, that's a lot. For a man who hasn't seen anything higher than 2 meters above his head in a year, it's freedom. Dan stands in the center of the park and looks up. The ceiling is white. The lights are bright. If you squint, you can imagine they're clouds. If you squint really hard. GA is setting up an oven in the corner of the park, a stone one, a real one, made of bricks that Greg fashioned from clay excavated during the level expansion. GA bakes the first loaf from the park oven in the presence of 120 people standing on the grass that smells like grass, watching the trees that smell like trees, and weep. Ron Pierce, the very same one who tried to open the gate. He stands by a birch tree and touches the bark, stroking it, like a dog. Hannah stands next to him and says nothing. Ron doesn't need words. He needs the birch bark beneath his fingers. On the 380th day, Dan gets 3 interceptions in a row from Al. Holt moved up the assault date. Sooner. 2 weeks sooner. The reason? His hydroponics system has started malfunctioning. Dan knows why. An error in the blueprints kicked in faster than he'd anticipated. The oxygen balance in Holt's system is dropping. In a month, his people will start suffocating. Holt has realized this, and he's angry, very angry. He doesn't know the error was intentional. He thinks his engineers assembled the system incorrectly, but the result is the same. He needs the Ark, urgently, not in 6 weeks, in 4. Dan revises the defense plan. 4 weeks isn't enough, but he's better prepared than the first time. Holt's first shaft is filled with concrete. Dan used 20 tons of cement from the stockpile and a week's worth of work to fill the breach from floor to ceiling. The second shaft is also filled, though Holt didn't manage to drill it all the way through. If Holt wants to dig again, he'll have to start from scratch. A new shaft, a new location, a new drilling job. A month, at least. But Holt isn't a fool. He won't be digging.
The intercept shows something else. Holt is gathering all his forces, 2,000 fighters, tanks, armored personnel carriers. He'll go head-on, through the main gates, not through the shaft, through the gates. steel doors weighing 14 tons each. Dan designed them to withstand a direct hit from a tank gun, but Holt isn't bringing just one gun. He's bringing 6. And he's bringing the shaped charge warheads his sappers have been preparing over the last month. And he's bringing 2,000 men who have nothing to lose, because in a month, they'll start suffocating. Dan stands in the command center in front of the monitors and feels real fear for the first time in a year. Not for himself, for Hope, who is 3 months old and sleeping in a cabin on level 6. For June, Hana's son, who is learning to read from old magazines in the Ark's library. For Lily, the asthmatic girl who is now running through the corridors and laughing. For the 418 people who call this place home. He looks at the screen, heat signatures on the map. The 2,000-strong column is moving south, toward him, speed 5 kilometers per hour. Vehicles on tracks across the ice. In 24 hours, they'll be here. Dan gathers everyone he needs: Maya, Al, Greg, Sarah, Marcus Chen, Sergeant Ridge, Holt's former soldier. Dan says an army will arrive at their gates tomorrow. 2,000 men, tanks, directed charges. He says the gate will withstand a direct hit, but it won't withstand 6. And it won't withstand directed charges if Holt places them correctly. Dan says he has one trump card, and it's not military force. It's words. Dan explains his plan. When Holt approaches the gate, Dan will go out to meet him, alone, unarmed, and he'll tell him the truth, the whole truth, about the error in the blueprints, about the fact that he knew about the planned assault, about the system, about the architect, about the fact that the eclipse was artificial, about the fact that they're both being tested, and about the fact that Holt is failing the test. Maya says it's suicide. Dan says suicide is 418 people in a grave underground when 6 tank shells blow the gate apart. Sarah says she won't let him go alone. Dan says that's exactly why he's going alone. So that if Holt shoots, 1 person dies, instead of 400. The room is silent.
Al speaks quietly. She says Dan is a nerd and an idiot, and that she'll go with him because someone has to monitor his frequency in case they need to jam Holt's signal. Dan says no. Al says she didn't ask. Arc 2 has begun construction in Carl's mine. In Arc 1, an underground park has opened with birch trees and grass. The controlled defect in the blueprints has worked, and Holt's hydroponics have begun to fail. Holt has moved his entire army to storm the Ark through the main gates. Dan decided to go out to Holt alone and tell him the truth about the system and the architect. Day 388, 4 hours until Holt's column arrives. Dan stands in his cabin on level 2 and gets dressed. Thermal underwear, 3 layers of insulation. The outer suit that Emma and Al developed over the past month, composite material, withstands minus 102 degrees. Dan zips up and catches himself thinking that his hands aren't shaking. They should be shaking. He's walking toward 2,000 armed men without a weapon, but his hands are steady. Maybe because trembling is a luxury that requires doubt, and Dan has no doubts. He knows this is the only way.
He walks through the level 2 corridor, past Sarah's cabin. The door is open. Sarah is standing in the doorway. She looks at him. She doesn't say a word. He stops. They stand facing each other for 3 seconds. Dan says he'll be back. Sarah nods, once. Then she turns away and goes back to her room. He knows she didn't believe him, and that she nodded anyway, because that's what people do when they don't know how to say goodbye. Dan goes up to level 1. Al is standing by the airlock, in a spacesuit, with a backpack containing a portable radio and a jammer she assembled overnight. Dan says he forbade her from going. Al says she's not in the army and doesn't obey orders. She obeys logic. And logic says that if Dan is killed and no one sends a signal to the Ark, Maya won't know when to close the emergency shutters. Dan is silent. She's right. He nods. They enter the airlock together.
The outside temperature is minus 103. The air doesn't move. There's nothing to move. The atmosphere is thin and dead and heavy as glass. Dan takes his first step outside, and the cold pierces through his suit. Not through the fabric, through his bones.
Minus 103 isn't cold in the usual sense. It's the absence of energy. The molecules barely move. The world has frozen. The snow doesn't crunch underfoot. It rings like broken glass. The sky is black, pitch black. No stars. A veil of clouds covers everything. Dan looks up and sees nothing. Emptiness. Cold. Darkness. And in that darkness, far to the north, lights. Headlights. Dozens of headlights. Holt's convoy. They're heading with Al to the intercept point. 400 meters from the gate. A hill. An open space. Dan stops at the top. Al sets up the station behind a rock and tunes the frequency. She says she's ready. Then she says that if he dies, she'll personally hack every server on the planet and write his name in history. Dan says he'd rather not die. Elle says that in that case, he better hurry up with the heroics because her fingers are freezing. The column approaches in 40 minutes. Tanks first. Behind them, the armored personnel carriers. Behind them, the infantry. 2,000 men in winter gear. Dan sees the steam from their breath, dim lights, the rumble of tracks on the ice. The column stops 200 meters from him. The first tank aims its barrel. Dan stands alone on the hill in the light of the single lantern he has placed beside him. A small figure in a field jacket facing 2,000 armed men. A man steps out of the lead armored personnel carrier, tall, massive, in an officer's overcoat over a thermal suit. Colonel Marcus Holt, 52 years old, a heavy face, weathered, eyes light and empty as ice. He walks toward Dan, alone, without a guard. Two figures on the hill, two men who have each been building their own worlds for 8 years, and now stand facing each other. Holt speaks first. He says that Dan is brave, but foolish. That bravery without strength is just a pretty way to die. That he has 6 tanks and 2,000 fighters, and that the Ark's gates won't withstand a volley. That Dan can surrender now, and everyone will survive. Or not surrender, and everyone will die. Dan listens. Then he speaks. Not what Holt expects. Dan says that the blueprints he gave to the Alliance contain an error, an intentional one. The oxygen balance is shifted by 12%. In 3 weeks, the Alliance's hydroponics will stop working completely. Holt freezes. His face remains unchanged, but his body stiffens. Dan continues. He says he's known about the second assault for a month. That Al is intercepting all Alliance communications. That Dan has read every one of Holt's orders from the past 6 weeks. Holt is silent. Dan speaks further. He says that the eclipse was artificial, that an isotope not found in nature was detected in the dust cloud, that someone or something triggered this apocalypse intentionally, that both Dan and Holt have the system, the interface, the tool, and that this tool was not given to them by chance. They are being tested, both of them. And the test isn't about who is stronger. The test is about who builds a world worth living in. Holt listens. His face reveals nothing. Then he speaks a single sentence. He asks how Dan knows about his system. Dan replies that one of Holt's former soldiers described how the colonel stands there, flipping through invisible pages. Holt is silent. For a long time. A minute. 2. There is no wind, absolute silence. Only the breathing of 2 people in masks. Then Holt speaks. Quietly. Without a commanding voice. He says he lost his daughter a year before the eclipse. Leukemia. She was 14.
He sat by her side in the hospital for 3 months.
The world was gentle and kind and warm, and the world had the best doctors and the best medicines and the kindest nurses. And the world couldn't save her. Gentleness didn't save her. Kindness didn't save her. So Holt stopped believing in gentleness. He believed in strength, in control, in discipline. Because if the world is too gentle to save a 14-year-old girl, then the world needs to be made harsher. Dan listens. He doesn't interrupt. Then he speaks. He says he understands, that he himself has lost everything. His career, his wife, 8 years of his life. That his mother had 3 heart attacks from the stress, that everyone thought he was crazy. He says that pain does not justify cruelty, that a harsh world would not have saved Holt's daughter any better than a gentle one, that a harsh world simply makes pain the norm. Dan says that 3 months ago a girl named Hope was born in his ark, and that he has built a world in which this girl will grow up seeing trees and grass and eating bread from Jia and learn to read from Hana, and that if Holt destroys this world, the test will be failed by both of them. Holt stands, silent. Behind him, 2,000 people await orders. He turns to them, then back to Dan. Then he pulls out his radio. He says one phrase, over and out. The column stands still. No one moves. Then movement slowly begins. Backward. The tanks turn around. The armored personnel carriers turn around. The infantry turns around. Holt stands on the hill and looks at Dan. He says he won't give up, that he's retreating, that he needs time to think, and that if Dan deceives him one more time, he'll come back, and this time he won't stand there talking. Dan nods. He says there will be no more deception, that he'll send the correct blueprints without mistakes. Holt looks at him for a long time. Then he turns and walks toward his column. Dan stands on the hill and watches the lights fade northward. 2,000 headlights go out one by one. Darkness returns. Dan stands there for another minute. Then he turns to Al. She's sitting behind a rock, shivering. Not from fear, from the cold. Dan says it's time to go home. Elle says she has a comment. Dan asks what it is. Elle says his speech scored 3 out of 10 on the persuasiveness scale, but 9 out of 10 on the recklessness scale. Dan doesn't smile, but he almost does. 2 months pass after Holt's retreat. Dan sends the revised blueprints, complete, precise, error-free. This decision costs him a sleepless night and a 3-hour argument with Maya. Maya says it's foolish, that Holt will get the technology and become stronger. Dan says Holt is already stronger. He has 2,000 fighters and tanks. If Holt wants to destroy the Ark, he'll do it sooner or later. The only way to defend against it is to make sure Holt doesn't want to. And for that, Holt needs to depend on the Ark not as a target, but as a partner. Dan says he's giving Holt the fish and the fishing rod, but the hook is tied to the Ark. If Holt's system works because Dan gave him the blueprints, then any breakdown will bring Holt back to Dan for consultation, not to attack, for help. Dependence through competence. Maya is silent. Then she says that this is either genius or catastrophically naive, and that she's hoping for the former. The tunnel is advancing. 23 kilometers from the Ark, 18 from Carl's mine. 41 kilometers out of 60. 19 left. 4 months of work. Ark 2 is under construction. Carl has expanded the mine. 4 new chambers. Hydroponics is up and running. The bioreactor is operational. The mushroom farm is yielding a harvest. The mine's population has grown to 82. People are coming. From the ruins, from the forests, from the frozen towns. Carl takes everyone in and puts them to work the very same day. His method is simple. You're here, here's a shovel. Dig. Questions later. Dan and Carl talk on the radio every evening, 10 minutes.
technical reports, oxygen consumption, water level, harvest, shield status. Carl speaks in short sentences. Dan responds in kind. Two engineers who understand each other without words. On the 430th day, something happens that Dan didn't plan for. A signal. Not from Holt, not from Carl. A new one. From the west. 300 kilometers. Weak. Encrypted. Al intercepts and decodes it. A message from a group of survivors in what used to be Portland. 112 people, living in the basement of a shopping mall. They have a generator, but they're running out of fuel. They have water, but no food. They have a doctor, 3 engineers, and 11 children. They're asking for help. Dan looks at the map. 300 kilometers. Far. Very far.
A snowmobile travels 30 kilometers per hour on flat ground. Under ideal conditions, a 10-hour trip. Conditions aren't ideal. 2 days, maybe 3. With enough fuel for the return trip. With a load of seeds, tools, and blueprints. This is a serious expedition. It's a risk. Dan brings the matter before the council. A vote, to send the expedition or not. The room argues for 2 hours. Cross, that very senator. He stands up and says that the Ark's resources aren't infinite, that every expedition is a risk, that they lost Tommy Kwan on a reconnaissance mission, that 300 kilometers is suicide, that they need to take care of their own instead of saving strangers. Dan listens. Then he stands up and says that a year ago, Cross was a stranger, and Maya was a stranger, and Gia, and Emma, and Al, and every one of the 418 people in this room was a stranger until they knocked on the gate. There are no our own. There are those we've helped and those we haven't helped yet. A vote. 391 in favor, 23 against, 4 abstained. The expedition is approved. Maya leads a group of 8, 4 soldiers, Greg, Engineer Ridge, 2 civilian volunteers, 2 snowmobiles, a cargo trailer. They leave at dawn. There is no dawn. There is darkness and headlights. Dan stands by the monitor and watches as 2 heat signatures drift westward. Small, alive, fragile. He watches them for 10 minutes. Then he returns to the tunnel. Maya returns in 6 days. Everyone is alive. The Portland group exists. 112 people in the basement of a shopping center. The generator is running on its last few liters. The children are pale. The doctor has red, swollen eyes from lack of sleep. But they're alive. Maya delivered the seeds, the blueprints, the instructions, and the first aid kit. The leader of the Portland group is a woman named Diana Flores, a former architect. She looked at the blueprints and said that in a month they would have hydroponics. Maya says that Diana is one of those people who look at a problem and see not a problem, but a blueprint for a solution. Dan writes down the name. Diana Flores, architect. Arc 3. 500 days. A year and a half. The tunnel between Arc 1 and Arc 2 is complete. The 2 shields met at a depth of 150 meters beneath the dead plane. Deviation from the calculated point, 14 centimeters. Dan stands in the tunnel and looks at the hole through which Carl Brenner's face is visible. Carl stands on the other side. They look at each other through the gap in the rock. Carl extends his hand. Dan extends his. A handshake across a 60-kilometer-long tunnel. Carl squeezes Dan's hand so hard that Dan has to massage his wrist for 2 days afterward. Then Carl says one word. It works. A week later, the first person walks through the tunnel, Gia, carrying a pot of soup. She walks 60 kilometers through an underground corridor 3 meters in diameter, carrying a pot of mushroom soup in her hands. A 9-hour walk. She comes to Carl. She sets the pot on the table. She says the soup has gone cold, but that can be fixed. Carl looks at her, at the pot, at the soup. Then he sits down and eats.
in silence. Jia sits across from him and smiles. This is the first hot meal prepared outside the mine that Carl's people have eaten in a year and a half. Carl finishes eating. He stands up. He says 2 words. "Give me some more." Jia laughs. Holt makes contact 2 days after the tunnel is opened. His voice is different.
Not commanding, not threatening, quiet. He says his hydroponics are working, that the oxygen is stable, that his people are eating fresh greens for the first time in a year. He thanks them, briefly, without details. Then he says he wants to meet, in person, without weapons, on neutral ground. Dan agrees. A meeting on an open plain 60 kilometers north of the Ark. Dan and Holt, 2 men in spacesuits. -100. A black sky. Silence. Holt says he's been thinking for 2 months, that Dan was right, not about everything, but about the main things. That the test is real, that the system is real, that someone is watching, and that the barracks wouldn't have passed the test. Holt says he doesn't want war, he wants peace, but on his terms. His people remain under his command. His territory remains his territory. But trade, exchange, aid, joint expeditions. Dan agrees. They don't shake hands. Holt isn't the type to shake hands. But they nod to each other, and that's enough. 2 years after the eclipse. The network. 5 points on the map. Arc 1, 442 people. Arc 2 in Carl's mine, 380. Arc 3 in Portland, 220. Little Ark in the mountains to the east, 90. Southern outpost on the border of former Oregon, 60. About 1,200 in total, plus 2,000 in the Holt Alliance, plus small groups with whom radio contact has been established, but who are still too far away for the tunnels. Another 800 or so. 4,000 people. Dan stands in front of the map and counts. 4,000 out of 8 billion. 0.00005% of humanity. The rest are either dead or somewhere beyond his range. He doesn't know. Satellites show heat signatures all over the planet. Hundreds, small groups, large groups, underground cities, bases, mines, bunkers. Humanity hasn't gone extinct. It's gone underground, like moles. Dan smirks. Now everyone's a mole. System updating. Closed ecosystem. Rank B. 4,127 lives saved. 312 closed cycles established. Dan looks at the numbers. 4,127. Including the Alliance, including the Portlanders, including the people in the small arcs who survived because Dan sent them seeds and blueprints. He didn't save them personally. He gave them the tools. And they saved themselves. But the system counts that, too. Dan is assembling a team for an external expedition, not reconnaissance, exploration. Al reports that a drone has detected an anomaly in the dust curtain, to the east, about 200 kilometers away. A thinning in the cloud cover, small, barely noticeable. But if the data is correct, at this point, the dust curtain is 40% thinner, and light can pass through it, not sunlight, but starlight. Dan wants to see it with his own eyes. He wants to see a star for the first time in 2 years. The 6-person expedition, Dan, Maya, Al, Greg, Sergeant Ridge, and Emma, who insisted because she wants to collect atmospheric samples from the thinning zone. 2 snowmobiles, a supply of fuel and oxygen, next-generation spacesuits, 4 hours of autonomy at -100 degrees. Estimated travel time, 8 hours. The time margin is minimal. If anything goes wrong, there will be no margin. They head out. Darkness, ice, silence. The snowmobiles roar into the void. The headlights cut through the darkness 200 meters ahead.
nothing beyond 200 meters. Dan is at the wheel of the first snowmobile. Maya is behind him. Al is at the wheel of the second.
They drive for 8 hours. They stop twice. They check their suits. They change oxygen cartridges. They eat energy bars through the valves in their masks. They don't talk. There's nothing to say. The world around them is dead, and there's nothing to talk about. 8 hours later, they stop. Dan looks up and sees the sky. Not black, dark gray, with a single bright spot, small, twinkling. There, high up, through a gap in the cloud cover, a star. One, the only one. Dan stands and stares at it, unable to move. 2 years, 730 days of darkness. And there it is, a point of light, tiny, far away, but real. Emma stands beside him, crying into her mask. Tears freeze on her cheeks. Maya stands at attention. Greg takes off his glove and wipes his eyes with his bare hand. 10 seconds. Then he puts the glove back on. Ridge is silent. Al takes out her camera and takes a picture. Then she says the photo is terrible because the camera isn't designed for this kind of cold, and that she'll redo it when she gets back and process it with digital filters. Dan doesn't answer. He's looking at the star. Emma is collecting samples. Air into sealed containers, snow samples, dust samples from the surface. She's working quickly because time is running out. The suits will hold out for another hour. Dan is standing on the hill and can't bring himself to leave. Maya walks over and says it's time. Dan nods. He doesn't leave. Maya takes his gloved hand and leads him to the snowmobile. Dan gets in. He looks back. The star is still there. Small, alone, but it's there. The way back. 8 hours. Dan drives the snowmobile and thinks. A tear in the veil. Finning. If the eclipse is artificial, and if the dust curtain is being sustained by something, then the finning means that something is weakening, or that someone is weakening it, or that the test is nearing its end. He doesn't know, but the gap is a fact, and a fact means hope. They return to the Ark, exhausted, frozen, alive. Dan goes straight to the lab. He takes samples from Emma. He analyzes them. The concentration of the anomalous barium isotope in the breach zone is 60% lower than in the normal atmosphere. The dust is dispersing, slowly, but it is dispersing. Dan sits down and does the math. If the current rate of dispersion continues, in a year the hole will expand. In 2 years, it will cover an area of 1,000 square kilometers. In 5 years, 20,000. In 10 years, half the sky. The atmosphere is clearing, on its own, or with help. Dan doesn't know. But the numbers say one thing: the sky will return. Dan makes an announcement at the general meeting. He shows a photograph of a star, a bad one, blurry, a single white dot on a gray background. The room watches, silent. Then someone starts clapping. Then everyone. 442 people are clapping and crying and hugging each other. Jia hugs Emma. Sarah hugs Greg. Hannah hugs her son June, who no longer understands why the adults are crying over a white dot in a photograph, because he doesn't remember the stars. He is 9 years old, and he doesn't remember the stars. Dan stands in the corner and looks at his city, at the people who have lived without a sky for 2 years and have just learned that the sky will return. He doesn't clap. He stands there and takes it all in, every face, every sound. Then he goes to the command center. He sits down at the monitor. He opens the system interface, and he types a message. Not over the radio, not via satellite, through the system. For the first time. He doesn't know if it works. He doesn't know if anyone is listening. He types a single sentence.
Who are you? The reply comes 37 days later. Not through the system, not over the radio. In person. Dan is sleeping in his cabin on level 2. It's 3 in the morning local time. The system interface lights up in the darkness as if someone had turned on the screen right in front of his closed eyes. Dan wakes up. A message. Coordinates. Latitude, longitude. A point 2 kilometers from the arc on the surface. And one word. Come. Dan lies there with his eyes open for 10 minutes. Then he gets up, gets dressed, spacesuit. Silently. Doesn't wake anyone, doesn't tell anyone. Doesn't leave a note. It's his decision, his test, his one-on-one. He walks through the airlock. The outside temperature is minus 97, 3 degrees warmer than a year ago. A trifle, but Dan notices. He notices everything. He's an engineer. He walks across the ice toward the coordinates. 2 kilometers, a 30-minute walk. Darkness. Silence. The sound of his boots on the crunching snow. He climbs the hill, the very same hill where he stood before Holt a year ago. And he sees.
Light. Not a lantern, not a headlight. Light that has no source. It simply is. Soft. White. Like dawn, but without a horizon. The light fills the space within a 10-meter radius around a single point. And at that point stands something. Not a person, not a machine, not a hologram. A figure, an outline, a silhouette that constantly shifts as if made of water or light or something for which Dan has no word. The figure has no face, it has no voice. But when it speaks to Dan, he hears it, not with his ears, inside. Daniel Kerr, builder, rank B ecosystem architect, 4,127 lives saved, 312 closed cycles. The test continues. Dan stands before the architect, and his legs won't move, not out of fear, out of the sheer scale of it. He is an engineer. He understands systems, and he understands that before him is a system he cannot comprehend. Not because it is complex, because it is different. As if an ant stood before a skyscraper architect and tried to understand why there are walls. Dan asks, why? Why the eclipse? Why did 8 billion have to die? Why did the world turn into an icy grave? Why? The answer comes not in words, in images. Dan sees Earth from above. 8 billion. Wars, pollution, species extinction, plastic in the oceans, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, nuclear warheads on standby. A civilization that built faster than it thought, that consumed faster than it restored, that knew it was heading toward the edge and couldn't stop. The architect shows other planets, other civilizations, dozens, hundreds, all passed through the same point, all reached the edge. Some fell, some were stopped. The eclipse is a pause, not a punishment, a test, a filter. Which of the 8 billion is capable not just of surviving, but of rebuilding, without repeating the mistakes, without repeating the greed, without repeating the blindness? Who is capable of building a closed cycle, not just of water and oxygen, a closed cycle of care, where every cog is screwed in with a specific person in mind? Dan listens, sees, understands, and gets angry. He says that 4,000 is not 8 billion, that billions have died, children, the elderly, people who never polluted the ocean or launched warheads, people who simply lived. He says the test is cruel, that the filter killed the innocent, that the architect had no right. The answer? A single image. Earth, 100 years from now, following the trajectory it was on before the eclipse. Dead. Not from the cold, from the heat.
scorched. The oceans have evaporated, the forests have burned. 8 billion would have died, all of them. Not 4,000, all of them. The eclipse didn't kill the world. The eclipse gave the world a chance. Ugly, cruel, unfair, but the only one. Dan stands in the architect's light and is silent. He is an engineer. He understands compromises. He knows that sometimes, to save the system, you have to shut down some of the circuits. He knows this and hates this knowledge. But he understands. He asks one last question. What next? How to bring back the sky? The answer? Keep building. Every arc, every tunnel, every closed loop, every life saved not by force, but by care, is a percentage of atmospheric purification. The system didn't lie. Stability points aren't game mechanics. They're a literal mechanism. Every point is a real impact on the dust curtain. Dan wasn't just building a bunker. He was building a key. And each of the 7 architects is building their own key. When all 7 systems reach a certain threshold, the curtain will disappear completely, and the sky will return. Dan asks how many of the 7 architects passed the test. The answer? 4. Dan, the architect in Japan, the architect in Switzerland, the architect in Kenya. 3 failed. One of them is Holt. Holt's system is failing because the barracks do not generate stability. It breeds dependence. Dependence on a single leader. A single leader is a single point of failure. Dan says that Holt has changed, that he has made peace, that his people eat greens and build. Answer: Holt is not an architect. Holt is an architect's vassal. His system works because it is connected to Dan's system. This is not a failure. It is a different path. Holt isn't building the key, but he isn't stopping Dan from building, and that's enough. The light begins to dim. The architect is leaving, or fading away, or shutting down. Dan doesn't know which word is right. He stands on the hill in the darkness, alone, and a voice sounds in his earpiece, calm, without inflection. Daniel Kerr, keep building. We're watching. Then silence. Dan stands on the hill. The sky is black. But in the east, far away, he sees it. A gap. More than a year ago. And through it, not just one star. 3, 4, 5. Small, twinkling, real. Dan raises his gloved hand toward the sky. His fingers are spread apart, stars between his fingers. He stands like that for a minute, 2. Then he lowers his hand, turns around, and walks down toward his city. In the arc, 3 in the morning has turned to 4. The corridors are quiet, the dim light of night mode. Dan walks past the dining hall on level 6. Behind the door, he can hear Zia working with dough. She bakes bread for breakfast every day, no days off. Because morning bread is the first thing people sense when they wake up, the smell. And the smell tells them the world is still here. Dan walks past the medical ward. Sarah is sitting at a table, writing something in a journal, with her left hand. 3 fingers. The rest are gone. She lost them on the threshold of this place 2 years ago, and never once complained. The 2 puppies she brought in under her jacket are now full-grown dogs. They're sleeping at her feet. One is snoring. Dan walks past level 9. Behind blue light is on outside the server room door. Al isn't asleep. Al never sleeps on time. She's sitting in front of the screen, cursing at the old server that's frozen up again. Her grandmother Rosa is sleeping on a chair nearby, wrapped in a blanket. She comes here every evening to be close to her granddaughter. Elle swears more quietly so as not to wake her. Dan walks past the park on level 4. The birch trees have grown to 2 meters tall.
The grass is thick, green. Ron Pierce is sleeping on the bench by the stove. He comes here every night. He lies down on the bench and listens to the silence. The silence here is different. Not dead. Alive. The silence of a tree that is growing. Dan walks past Hana's cabin. The door is ajar. Inside, Hana is reading a book to June. June is 9. He doesn't remember the world before the eclipse. For him, the world is the ark. And he thinks the world is beautiful. Because in the world there is bread and trees and dogs and a mom who reads books. Dan hears Hana speaking softly in Korean and June falling asleep. Dan walks past the lab. Emma is there. Of course, she's there. She's transplanting seedlings of a new wheat variety she's developed over the past 4 months. Frost-resistant. For outdoor cultivation.
When, someday, when the sky returns. She's getting ready. She's always getting ready. Dan stops at the door and watches. Emma looks up. She sees him. She smiles. She says he looks like he's seen a star. Dan says he's seen 5. Emma doesn't understand. He doesn't explain. She'll understand tomorrow. Dan reaches his cabin on level 2. He opens the door. He sits down on the bunk. On the table is a thermos mug with a message about the world's worst engineer. That very one. 8 years. $4 million. 12,000 hours of welding. 3 heart attacks for mom. 1 divorce. 2 psychiatrists. A newspaper article. Neighbors who called him Mole. And here it is. 4,127 lives. 5 arcs. 312 closed cycles. 1 girl named Hope. 1 underground park with birch trees. 1 loaf of bread every morning. 1 star. Then 5. Dan lies down. He closes his eyes. He doesn't know how long it will take to clean the atmosphere. Years, maybe 10, maybe 20. But he knows the sky will return. Because 4 of the 7 architects are building keys. Because every closed cycle is a percentage of purification. Because every life saved by care rather than force is a step toward the light. He falls asleep. Underground. In the warmth. In the house. That he built for specific people. For Jia, who bakes bread. For Sarah, who heals everyone with 3 fingers. For Elle, who curses at servers and loves her grandmother. For Emma, who is growing the future. For Hana, who reads books to her son. For Maya, who stands between him and the world. For Hope, who has never seen the stars but will surely see them. For Carl, who says 1 word, and that's enough. For 4,127 people who are alive because 1 engineer with a mug of coffee spent 8 years digging a hole in the ground. And he was right.